who we know have serious concerns, including the Archbishop of Canterbury, doesn't he, who says that God doesn't want this.
Yeah, well, look, you know, I'm not here to represent God. I'm here to represent the British people and my constituents. And my constituents want us to sort out the problem of illegal immigration. And we're going to have to, whether he likes it or not, is going to be tough. So, look, we know that the Lords are going to cut up rough. But at the end of the day, the House, and they'll put down their amendments, no doubt, to the bill. We all know this is coming. And it's the House of Commons will have to overturn those amendments and send it back and say, look, you've had your say. The elected House must have its way.
But it's the time scale, isn't it? And it's the ping pong that can be played. I mean, do you honestly, hand on heart, think that there will be a flight that goes before the election, Philip?
I genuinely don't know, and I don't know how long the House of Lords are going to mess about with it. That's out of the Prime Minister's control. He can only do what he can do. He's passed this legislation. Everybody accepts that it's the toughest legislation that any government's ever introduced on immigration, on illegal immigration. It disregards the Human Rights Act. It disregards decisions by the European Court of Human Rights. It's not compatible with the European Convention on Human Rights. It is as tough as anyone could ever imagine a government doing. And so, of course, the House of Lords are not going to like it, but we've got to stick with it. And the timescales of the election are out of the Prime Minister's control. We can only do what we can do, and he's doing the best he can in the timescales he's got.
Philip, I want to ask you about another big problem for the government. It's this admission from the Home Office that 6,000 asylum seekers are missing from the system and they don't know where they are. I mean, how is this allowed to happen in 2024? I mean, this is potentially 6,000 people who have gone into the underground economy, potentially even criminal gangs.
Yeah, this is nothing new. This has been happening for years and donkey's years, and you know, and it's inevitable. I mean, I would like to see personally, when people come here claiming asylum, I'd like to see them detained until their application is processed. I mean, if they're genuinely fleeing persecution, I don't see there's any harm in them being safely detained. That they're fleeing persecution until we can properly assess their application, and if they're genuine, they can be allowed into the community, and if they're not, then they can be deported. If you don't have that system, it's pretty inevitable that people who are falsely claiming asylum, bogus asylum seekers, if you like, are going to disappear into the economy because they're not going to want to have their application processed because they know it's going to be rejected. So, of course, they're going to disappear. This has been happening for years and years and years.
Is the system working, though, Philip? Because the criticism this morning is that these asylum seekers are not being fully assessed, that they are being, you know, taken off the list too soon to try and meet the target set by Rishi Sunak, trying to clear that backlog. Well,
again, this is a problem that Rishi Sunak inherited, a massive backlog of applications. And that's why, in many respects, people couldn't be detained because the applications were taking so long. You couldn't detain people for that length of time. You know, the Prime Minister was right to say we need to get down the backlog. But look, you know, the thing of I remember this being an issue 20 years ago.
But you've been in power. You've been in power for 13 years to try and fix it, and still this asylum system is in chaos. Continuing chaos.
No, exactly, which is why we need this bill. That's the whole point. That's why we need this bill to try and sort it out. I just want to pick you up slightly on this thing of we've been in power for 13 years. I mean, it's a slight misnomer. I mean, the first 5 years we were in coalition with the Lib Dems, so we were never going to be able to do anything tough on immigration. When we
but you were still in government.
But we didn't have a majority in Parliament. There's no way that we were going to do that. So that was it. We won a very small majority in 2015, which most of that Parliament for 2 years was taken up with the Brexit referendum. In 2017, we lost our majority, so we had no majority in Parliament then. The first time we actually had any kind of majority was in 2019, and within 3 months of that, we had the COVID pandemic. So this idea that we've had this sort of huge Conservative majority for 14 years is just not true. We've had a Conservative majority since 2019, in effect, and that was taken up mainly by COVID.
OK. You've made your point, Philip. Don't go anywhere, because we want you to make further points shortly. We will talk to you again. Thank you, Philip Davis. Now, let's talk to Will Hollis, who is in Lincolnshire for us this morning. This is just the most heartbreaking story this week.
It really is, yes. Of course, it's of the 2-year-old Bronson Battersby. The sister of Bronson Battersby has said she does not blame social services for his death.
Yes, Bronson's body was found in a property in Skegness, and he's believed to have starved to death after his dad suffered a fatal heart attack.
Well, joining us now is our reporter, Will Hollis. Very good to see you this morning, Will. And give us the latest. We've had these remarks now from the sister of Bronson Battersby.
Yes, for the last few days, the news around this has been dominated by Bronson's mum, a lady called Sarah, who didn't live at home here in Prince Alfred Avenue. She'd split from Bronson's father, Kenny, of course, who Bronson was found in the arms of. Both tragically died over that period at Christmas. And the blame has squarely been from Bronson's mum on social services. But now we're hearing a different story from the family, from Melanie Battersby, who's been speaking to the BBC. Now, she's Bronson's older sister, much older, in her late 30s, and she's Kenny's her father, but not the same mother as Bronson. And she's been telling the BBC she believes social services and the police did what they could within the powers that they had. She also went on to say that while her dad was born to be wild and not an angel, he really loved his children. A stark contrast to what we've been hearing, at least in regard to the social services angle. This is something that has been described as a tragic incident by social services at Lincolnshire County Council, who was having regular visits to Bronson at home here in Skegness. Now, they've ordered a rapid review, something that should take about 2 weeks and will involve all sorts of different agencies, including the police. That's going to come in about, the results from that are going to come in about the 2nd of February, so we should hear from that one fairly soon. But what we've also been hearing from the Lincolnshire Police is that they've referred themselves to the IOPC. That's the police watchdog, which is a standard procedure whenever there's a death relating to police involvement, deaths that could be deemed to be preventable, and the IOPC has said that they've received that. The other story that we've been hearing around this is that only hours after the home was discovered and the bodies were discovered, thieves broke in to steal a wallet and pills, tramadol. That's something that was first reported in the Daily Mail, but was since confirmed by Lincolnshire Police. Now, they said that they are investigating because offenders appeared to have broken in through a window to gain entry. So at a time when the nation is mourning, when people in Skegness are incredibly saddened in this quite sleepy seaside town, at least over winter, some people were taking an opportunity to steal from people that had only within recent days lost their lives.
Will, some of the details that we've been reading, they are just so appalling, and you can maybe expand on this, but little Bronson being just 2 inches too short to be able to reach up for food, an emaciated dog found at the scene as well, the pet dog that I think survived but was in very poor way. I mean, what that individual must have walked in on, you know, beggars belief, doesn't it?
Yes, well, it was social services that were trying to make repeated visits since the end of Christmas time. The last time that Bronson was seen alive was on the 26th on Boxing Day. And despite 2 other occasions when social services tried to get a response by knocking on the door, police being communicated to that non-response, it was only after a 3rd visit in late January, around the 9th of January. So at least 2 weeks later since Bronson had been found. And it was that social services team, as well as the landlady, and also shortly after the police, as well as paramedics that went in. And it's really quite shocking to hear of those details, isn't it, about the young age, 2 years old, incredibly vulnerable, so small that he couldn't get inside to get the fridge where there was leftovers that had been there since Christmas. We were told in media reports that there was definitely chicken in there because the family didn't like turkey. There was no snacks on the lower cupboards because Bronson loved his snacks so much, his chocolates and his crisps, that they were raised to a higher level. So it just shows the circumstances that if things had been a little bit different. Maybe if social services had been able to get access quickly, if there was food and water in a way that the young toddler was able to grab it, then maybe he would have still been alive. But what we're hearing from that BBC report from his much older sister, that they don't blame social services. And I think what a lot of organisations are saying is this is a really tragic incident. And we will hear from that review if there is any process that could be better in the future to stop this from happening. But certainly whenever you have children, whenever you have a shocking case like this, it really does pull on the heartstrings of the nation.
It certainly does. Will Hollis there for us in Skegness. Thank you very much indeed. Now,
Sorry, Ellie.
No, you go for it.
Steel giant Tata is expected to press ahead with its plans to close blast furnaces on its Port Talbot site in South Wales, and it could result in the loss of 3,000 jobs. That announcement is expected imminently.
Yes, the company is set to announce a decision this morning. We're expecting about 11 a.m. onwards after a meeting between its executives and the unions broke down. Well, joining us now in the studio again is Conservative MP for Shipley, Philip Davies. Very good to see you, Bill. Not good news, though, for those in Port Talbot. We're expecting job losses of about 3,000 this morning. I mean, it's going to absolutely decimate the community there, isn't it?
No, it's terrible. Terrible news for people who work there. Well, look, the fact of the matter is this is the inevitable consequence of this mad rush to net zero. Let's be honest about what this is about. This is about decarbonising the plant. This is about the fact that people don't want all these carbon emissions, particularly on the left of policy. We'll have Stephen Kinnock, no doubt, soon, as from the Labour Party.
Well, actually, you say those words. He is here, waiting, actually. Let's talk to him. Shadow Immigration Minister and the local MP, Stephen Kinnock. Thank you ever so much for joining us this morning. Do you believe that there could still be time to pull back, for Tata to pull back from this announcement? What other solution do you want to see?
Yes, I do believe there's time. The statutory consultation procedure will be 45 days. That will be triggered tomorrow, I think. And that's time for Tata Steel to get back round the table with the unions and look again at the compelling multi-union plan, which was about keeping one of the blast furnaces going and combining that with electric arc furnace, and having time then to invest in direct reduced iron capability, which would be a bridge to the future that we need to have, rather than the cliff edge that they have done, a deal with the UK government, £500 million of taxpayers' money for 3,000 redundancies, and making the UK the only country in the G20 that no longer has the ability to create its own steel from scratch. That does not sound like a good deal to me, and I hope that we're urging Tata Steel to get back round the table and look at the trade union plan again.
I mean, you can feel the impact on the ground, can't you, Mr. Kinnock? You can feel it in your constituency. But I do want to ask you, Labour want to go green, don't they? Promising to spend £28 billion on green projects if you win the next election. But you are seeing job losses here. Potentially, we're going to hear about thousands of jobs going today. Is this the cost of going green? And lots of viewers watching this right now would fear that this would become a common sight under a Labour government.
Well, there's two things I'd say to that. One is we clearly are facing a climate crisis. I mean, most people can see with all the extreme weather events and many other issues around the world that there is, the planet is burning. But the other key point is, from a commercial point of view, the customers are voting with their feet. Customers are now looking for cleaner, greener products with a lower carbon footprint. So we have to recognise that. And then the question is, how you get there. The world is moving, the train is leaving the station, we've got to get on it, but there's many, many ways of doing that. And there is a huge opportunity to, as I say, invest in technologies like direct reduced iron and combine that with electric arc furnaces, and you can keep your current customer base and be ready to embrace the opportunities of the future without cutting us off. And that, I think, is what the Labour £3 billion Clean Steel Fund is all about. It's all about having an industrial strategy which supports steelmakers to buy and construct the assets they need, to get us to that better.
Stephen, I'm so sorry. We are absolutely out of time. Really appreciate you joining us on GB News, and we will, of course, bring you the latest very shortly.
Thank you.
A brighter outlook with Box Solar, sponsors of weather on GB News.
Morning, Alex Berkill here again with your latest GB News weather forecast. Watch out for some icy patches and freezing fog in places this morning. Otherwise, it is going to be a mostly sunny day for many of us, but across parts of Scotland in particular, here we are likely to see some further outbreaks of rain, sleet and some significant snow too could cause some problems, especially on the roads. Elsewhere, and like I said, lots of fine sunny weather around and mostly light winds, but it is still going to feel quite chilly. Temperatures may be up a degree or so compared to late, but still a little bit on the low side, even for the time of year, and feeling even colder in the north, where we have that wintry weather and some strong winds. Through this evening and overnight, staying dry with largely clear skies across southeastern parts. As a result, we are likely to see a touch of frost here. Further north and west, though, turning increasingly cloudy, the winds will strengthen, and we are going to see some rain, perhaps even some hill snow pushing in as we go through the early hours of tomorrow morning, and all that unsettled weather will lift our temperatures compared to recent nights. Saturday morning then, a touch of frost in the southeast first thing, staying dry here through much of the day, but increasing amounts of clouds. Elsewhere, a cloudier picture, further outbreaks of rain. Some of these could be heavy at times, particularly over higher ground towards the west, and it is going to be windy too, with the risk of coastal gales. Temperatures higher than they have been recently though. On Sunday, it's looking even milder, likely to get into double figures, but it is going to be wet and very windy, potentially stormy too. Bye-bye.
That warm feeling inside from Boxed Boilers, sponsors of weather on GB News.
I'm Christopher Hope.
And I'm Gloria Di Piero, bringing you
PMQ's live here on GB News. Every Wednesday, we'll bring you live coverage of Prime Minister's questions when Rishi Sunak and Sir Keir Starmer go head-to-head in the House of Commons.
We'll be asking our viewers and listeners to submit the questions that they would like to put to the Prime Minister, and we'll put that to our panel of top politicians in our Westminster studio.
That's PMQ's live here on GB News, Britain's election channel.
In the GB Newsroom, we bring you the news as it happens. With our team of dedicated journalists across the UK, we're ready to give you accurate reporting every day. When the news breaks, we'll be there with bulletins on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Your weekend starts here with Friday Night Live with me, Mark Dolan, 8 till 9 on GB News. Big stories, big guests and big laughs as we get you ready for a cracking weekend. That's Friday Night Live with Mark Dolan. Fridays 8 till 9 on GB News. Bring your own drinks. The admission's free.
Good afternoon, Britain.
Good afternoon, Britain. Join us, Tom and Emily,
to find out what's happening in the heart of Westminster
and why it matters to you.
Weekdays from midday, we bring you the most compelling stories from across the United Kingdom.
And from your doorstep to our inbox.
That's right, we want to hear from you.
GB News,
Britain's news channel.
Big news, big debates, big opinion. Patrick Christie's Tonight is the week's biggest show. Every weekday, 9 to 11 p.m, we've got the inside track on the day's top stories. There'll be sharp takes you won't get anywhere else. We will set the news agenda, not just follow it, and I want to bring you along for the ride. Whatever it is, we'll have our finger on the pulse. It's news, but it's this close to entertainment. Patrick Christie's Tonight, 9 to 11 p.m, only on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
GB News is Britain's news channel, and now you can support it. All you have to do is scan that QR code that's up on your screen right now, or you can go to gbnews.com/support and become a GB News member. You'll have fantastic benefits. We're also going to organise special events where you as GB News members can meet the presenters, the on-screen faces. Scan the QR code or go to gbnews.com/support. Thank you so much.
Join us every night on GB News at 11 p.m. for Headliners, which is 3 top comedians going through the next day's news stories, which is exactly what you need, because when the establishment has gone crazy, you need some craziness to make sense of it.
Headliners. You don't have to bother reading the newspaper. We've got it covered for you. every night at 11 p.m. and repeated every morning at 5 a.m. We won't send you to sleep like some of the other paper review shows out there.
So join us 11 p.m. every night on GB News.
The People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
I'm Michelle Dewberry, and I'm not here to tell you what to think. I'd much rather hear what you have to say. So send in your opinions to gbviews@gbnews.com. Keep them clean, and you never know, I might read them out. With my panel here on Jubes & Co, we debate, we get stuck into the issues of the day on a show where all views are welcome, especially yours. GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Good morning. It is 10 a.m. on Friday, the 9th of January. You are watching and listening to Britain's Newsroom on GB News with Ellie Costello and Pip Thompson.
Tata Steel job cuts. Around 3,000 jobs are at risk today as the steel giant pushes ahead with plans to close furnaces in South Wales.
Another Rwanda roadblock. The House of Lords threatens to stop Rishi Sunak's flagship policy as the Home Office admits more than 6,000 asylum seekers are missing in the UK.
Bad behaviour in school. The Ofsted chief warns in some schools there are no-go areas for teachers. This comes as the education watchdog vows to make changes to the system following the head teacher Ruth Perry taking her own life.
Capital fare freeze. Travel fares in London have been frozen for a year. London's Mayor Sadiq Khan says he wasn't prepared to stand by while passengers pay more for public transport.
And a call to arms. A top NATO chief issues a stark warning that civilians should prepare themselves for an all-out war with Russia over the next 2 decades. How would you feel about young people being forced to serve for their country?
Plenty to get your teeth into there, and we will of course bring you that announcement from Tata Steel where it's expected that 3,000 jobs will go. We will bring you that announcement live here on GB News. Let's get your headlines, a full roundup now with Sam Francis.
Pip, Ellie, thank you very much and good morning from the GB Newsroom. The headlines at just after 10 o'clock. Well, our top story today is that more than 3,000 jobs are at risk, with steel giant Tata expected to press ahead with their plans to close furnaces in South Wales. The job losses are understood to be UK-wide, but most will be from the Port Talbot site. It's considered to be the country's single biggest emitter of carbon dioxide, and the cuts come as the company moves to a greener way of working. Unions are holding talks with executives later to try to save jobs. Shadow Immigration Minister Stephen Kinnock says the closure will hurt the economy.
They have done a deal with the UK government, £500 million of taxpayers' money for 3,000 redundancies and making the UK the only country in the G20 that no longer has the ability to create its own steel from scratch. That does not sound like a good deal to me. And I hope that we're urging Tata Steel to get back round the table and look at the trade union plan again.
Meanwhile, the Home Office has admitted that more than 6,000 asylum seekers are missing in the UK. It comes as members of the House of Lords outline plans that could stall Rishi Sunak's flagship Rwanda policy. The group of peers, led by a former Labour Attorney General, wants to delay the treaty until the government can show that Rwanda is safe for asylum seekers. New Ofsted guidance will allow school visits in England to be paused if staff show any signs of distress. The announcement comes after a coroner called for change following the death of head teacher Ruth Perry. She took her own life in January last year after Caversham Primary School was downgraded from outstanding to inadequate. The coroner said there was an almost complete absence of training for inspectors who were looking out for signs of distress in school leaders. A senior NATO official has warned that there could be an all-out war with Russia within the next 20 years. Dutch naval officer Admiral Rob Bauer says that although the military alliance is preparing for conflict, civilians must also be ready. It comes after Defence Secretary Grant Shapps said the threat could be sooner and more wide-reaching, possibly involving Russia and China, Iran and North Korea. Defence editor at the Evening Standard, Robert Fox, told GB News earlier there's a real risk of the conflict spreading.
Grant Shapps said he thought we were lucky if we've got 5 years. And this is certainly what the Baltic countries, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, are warning us, because they say after Ukraine, where Russia is on a roll again, it's going to be us, and we're all going to be involved.
Well, meanwhile, a ban on the Islamist group Hizb ut-Tahrir comes into force today. That's after MPs backed the plan to ban the group as a terrorist organisation, after the Home Secretary put an order before Parliament making it illegal to join that group. James Cleverly has branded the group anti-Semitic and says that it actively promotes and encourages terrorism. Travel fares in the capital have been frozen for a year as customers avoid a 14% price rise. The freeze will apply to pay-as-you-go fares for bus, tube, DLR and tram journeys and the majority of London Overground trips. Sadiq Khan, who chairs Transport for London, said he wasn't prepared to stand by while passengers pay more for public transport. The Mayor of London has said that the price freeze will be paid for by allocating £123 million of funding from the Greater London Authority. 1/3 of adults will run out of money by the end of this month, that's according to new data. Finance firm Karma says the high cost of Christmas is to blame for the sting in January budgets, as many people wait longer to get paid and they're coping with expensive winter energy bills. The credit company also found that more than half of people strapped for cash will have spent their entire month's income by 20th of January. To help balance budgets, figures suggest that more than a quarter of people plan to avoid socialising, while almost half of us will hold off from purchasing any new tech or gadgets. This is GB News. For more, we're on TV, on digital radio and on your smart speaker. Just say, play GB News. Now, though, it's back to Ellie and Pip.
Thanks, Sam. So many of you getting in touch this morning. Thank you so much for your company. Of course, huge reaction to Port Talbot and Tata Steel and potentially thousands of job losses being announced this morning. Susan, good morning to you, says Britain should work towards being self-sufficient amid all of this worldwide tension. It just doesn't make sense not to depend on any country.
Ron says we should definitely keep our own steel production. When Russia invaded Ukraine, we couldn't afford to heat our homes. It is best to not depend on anyone.
Yeah, and Marge says the Welsh Government must explain how we lose our ability to produce steel. 3,000 people lost their jobs because they deem it's not green. Yet we also import steel made somewhere else in the world, which must be increasing our carbon emissions. Very interesting point, yeah.
And also, Danny, good morning to you. You say, why are we closing the steelworks at the cost of 3,000 jobs when the steel will be imported from China, who will still put the same amount of CO2 into the air, if not more? Then there's the extra CO2 from shipping it all the way here. It makes no sense at all.
Yeah, no, thank you so much for your views. Do keep them coming in on any of the stories that we are talking about this morning. gbviews@gbnews.com.
Steel giants, as we are saying, Tata, are expected to press ahead with plans to close blast furnaces on its Port Talbot site in South Wales, resulting in the loss of an expected 3,000 jobs by the end of the year.
Well, the site is considered to be the UK's biggest single emitter of carbon dioxide, and a move to a more greener way of working could see Wales cut emissions by a fifth.
Joining us is economics editor Liam Halligan. Good morning to you, Liam. So we are expecting that announcement in the next hour or so. Just explain to us, this has been a steelworks since, 1900. How devastating is the impact going to be to people there? I'm sure you've been talking to a number of them.
It is a bright, crisp and sunny South Wales morning here in Port Talbot, Pip. But the mood locally is anything but. This is Britain's biggest steelwork. Britain is, of course, the country which in the 18th and 19th century pioneered the use of blast furnaces, using coking coal to make what we call virgin steel, steel from scratch. And for a lot of that period, Britain was the predominant steelmaker in the world. We've got 4 blast furnaces in this country now, 2 at Scunthorpe, 2 here in Port Talbot, our biggest steelworks, and it seems that all 4 are now going to be closed down. 8,000 people work for Tata, the Indian conglomerate in steelmaking in the UK. 4,000 of them here at Port Talbot. As we speak, behind me, you see the two blast furnaces. In that steelworks, Tata bosses are talking to a gobsmacked workforce. It seems that we could see here at least 3,000 job losses of the 4,000 people that work at this plant, and some job losses elsewhere at Tata sites around the country. This is a steel town in its bones. People here have talked to me about the smell of the blast furnaces, the sound of the blast furnaces being their sense of home. Steelmaking, it is a dirty business, it is a rough business, but for people here, it's their lifeblood and has been for generations. A lot of people here find it very difficult to understand why we should be closing down steelworks in this country when we won't be able to make our own steel afterwards, only scrap steel using so-called arc furnaces, which are greener but employ far fewer people. And they wonder why it is that Britain is making these huge sacrifices when in countries like China, they're building coal-fired power stations ever more every year.
Well, this is the thing, Liam. Many people would say it's short-sighted. I mean, you mentioned there the blast furnaces at Scunthorpe also set to close down. It would leave the UK as the only G20 country, I believe, that cannot make steel from raw materials. I mean, how sensible is that? When we're seeing headlines like the front of the Daily Telegraph today saying NATO warns of war with Russia in the next 20 years. You would think that British industry and investing in our own industries is more important now than ever.
Look, we are largely a service sector economy in the UK. 80% of our GDP, of our economy, is services. Legal services, financial services, creative services, hospitality, and all the rest of it. But that doesn't mean that steel making isn't important. You know, you want to build a building, you need steel. You want to build arms, you need steel. So many processes have steel at their heart. And as these 4 blast furnaces close, as you rightly say, we can only then make steel from recycled steel, from scrap steel, from relying on imported steel, which of course involves huge carbon emissions, using green-friendly, environmentally friendly so-called arc furnaces rather than blast furnaces that rely on coking coal. As an economist, as somebody who's studied the steel industry for years and years and years, as somebody who is steeped in geopolitics, I'm a former Moscow correspondent, it does strike me as pretty short-sighted to completely remove all our independent steelmaking, not just capacity, but expertise. The men and women who work in the steel plant behind me, they make some of the highest quality specialised steel anywhere in the world using processes that often their fathers, grandfathers and great-grandfathers helped to implement. This is a hugely symbolic story. It combines regional policy, clashing with environmental policy, clashing with the lives and livelihoods of ordinary men and women here in this part of the UK, a proud steel community who this morning are feeling completely bereft and put upon. This is being done to them, in their view, by a political and media class that promotes environmentalism above everything else at their expense.
People are saying, couldn't the closure of one of the blast furnaces have been deferred? It didn't have to be done so quickly. And why not switch to maybe a hydrogen furnace?
Indeed, the trade unions, I've been in touch with the trade unions about this story for many, many months. You'll remember in my On the Money programme on GB News, we often spoke to steel makers, representatives of the steel industry, the Confederation of British Metal Formers who use British steel, who want to prioritise British steel, even though it's a little bit more expensive than some of the imported steel because it is such high quality. There are lots and lots of jobs here at stake. There are strategic imperatives here at stake. There's also a lot of money at stake. Tata, the Indian conglomerate that owns this plant here, that owns Scunthorpe, they say they're putting in £2.5 billion in order to close down these blast furnaces and move to these arc furnaces that rely not on coking coal, but they're getting a 500 million quid bung from the British government. So taxpayers are actually paying for this transition. And that is another thing that's so galling to the local community here in Port Talbot. Not only is this being done to them against, in their view, all logic, as taxpayers, they're also having to pay for it. This is going to be a very difficult thing politically. Rishi Sunak is backing this move. His government is putting up the 500 million quid that Tata have insisted on. Otherwise, they'll close down steelmaking here completely. What's the Labour government going to say? It's going to be very difficult for them because they have their sort of pro-green credentials that they want to flaunt to their metropolitan voters. And yet here we are in South Wales, traditionally a Labour heartland. I expect a lot of dancing on pinheads by the Labour leadership in response to this, and I expect a great deal of anger from the trade union movement when news finally breaks. We're expecting an announcement at 11:30, Pip, and as I say, as we speak, in the steelworks behind me, a bereft workforce is being addressed by the management of Tata.
Liam, thank you so much for that update. We will, of course, come back to you when that announcement is formally made. Our economics and business editor, Liam Halligan, there.
Now, the Home Office has admitted more than 6,000 asylum seekers are missing in the UK.
This comes as a Labour peer outlines a potential roadblock that could stall Rishi Sunak's flagship Rwanda policy. Joining us in the studio is political commentator John Oxley. Good morning to you, John. Good to see you. But Rishi Sunak does seem to be pitting himself against the House of Lords, where, of course, we know there's no overall Tory majority. We were talking to Philip Davis a little earlier, Conservative MP, who said it is full of worthy lefties. Do you agree with that? And do you think this is the House of Lords are going to be very, very difficult, and this ping-pong could go on for a long time?
I mean, the House of Lords is going to be very difficult. I mean, at the moment, you know, the way the Lords has been set up is so no party has a majority. You have a lot of crossbenchers. You do have a lot of Tory Lords, but not enough to carry something through. And the real issue for Rishi Sunak is the mechanisms that are normally there for Parliament to override the law, for the Commons to override the Lords, do exist. But one is something called the Salisbury Convention, which you can only use if you're talking about something that was in a manifesto. Rwanda Plan wasn't in the 2019 manifesto. And then you've got the Parliament Acts. But the way they work is you have to send something to the Lords multiple times over the space of more than a year. So it's simply not possible for that to happen, to force things through in the Lords. So if this is going to become law, he's going to have to find a way to get enough peers on side to vote it through. So I think it's going to be a very difficult passage in the Lords, particularly, you know, there's not a lot of parliamentary time left between now and when there's potentially going to be an election.
I mean, we could see months of parliamentary ping-pong, as it's called. Do you think that we will see flights take off before a general election?
I think it's very unlikely at this stage. I think it's going to be very hard to get the Act through Parliament. Even then, you know, you have to implement the thing. There is still potential for some legal challenges when you start to move someone through. You know, and you know, if we're looking at an election 7 or 8 months away, sort of maximum, that's a very difficult timetable to stick to.
And we were talking to Philip Davis about, you know, come on, we still see these high numbers. We're talking about the number of people, 6,000 asylum seekers that have been lost in the system. And I put it to Philip Davis that, hang on, you've been in power since 2010. You've had a long time to try and fix this. And he said, well, we were in coalition for part of that time. I mean, does he have a point that the Tories haven't actually had free rein to sort this out?
To an extent, but you play the hand you're dealt. And one of the big problems with asylum seekers going missing and the use of the hotels is we weren't building sufficient detention centres. We weren't creating anywhere to put these, and that's not necessarily, I think, something you can blame the coalition for. It was a spending cuts thing, and it is partly, as we've seen, in the last 18 months, when the Tories have tried to raise this again, it's deeply unpopular whenever you try to, take over a site and try to make it into an asylum detention centre. I think really, when you look at some of these problems, the Conservatives haven't addressed them, haven't pushed through the things you needed to get in place for this to work. You talk about the coalition. It's also, it's now been 7 or 8 years since the Conservatives stopped being in coalition. They had a majority in 2015, they had a confidence and supply, which gave them a majority after 2017. And, for 4 years now, they've had a majority of 80, I think it's a bit rich to sort of say that that's the problem. And fundamentally, if you wanted to fix these things, you should have won the election properly in 2010.
COVID was another reason he came out with as to why they haven't got to grips with it more quickly. I mean, governments have hard stuff to deal with all the time. You can look through, all sorts of examples from the part. You had a US president, George W. Bush, who's a US president, came in, and 8 months later, 9/11 happened, and it completely changed the trajectory of his presidency. The point of being in power is, you deal with things as they come up and you get your plan through. I think it's a bit rich to sort of sit back and say, oh, well, OK, we've been in power for 14 years, but technically we can't fix these things. I mean, what's the point of being in power? It's always going to be hard. You're always going to have political negotiations. If you can't get stuff done, then why be there?
I mean, we talk about the system all the time, don't we? And we describe the backlog that we're seeing in our asylum system. But ultimately, we need to have a system that actually works. Because what we're looking at here is this admission from the Home Office that there are 6,000 people who they now don't know where they are, could be in criminal gangs, could be in the underground economy. And the criticism in the papers this morning is that this is all down to the pressure on the system, trying to hurry people through without fully assessing them to try and clear these backlogs.
Exactly. We don't have the resources in the Home Office. And going back to the point I was making about detention centres, one of the big problems is we don't have anywhere to put these people. We don't have anywhere secure. And so what you're doing is you're putting them in hotels or temporary accommodation. There's no one there watching them.
And there's reports that they're being moved from one hotel to another hotel, maybe 70 miles down the road.
Yeah.
How's that saving money?
I mean, it's not. It's just sort of juggling things through. But the big risk for that is, there's no one really at these hotels making sure they stay there. And if you are, one of these asylum seekers and you want to sort of disappear, it's very easy to. And equally, these criminal gangs that prey on them and exploit them, it's very easy for them to come into contact with these asylum seekers because there's no one looking after them, whether it's sort of guarding them or whether it's keeping an eye out for them. And they're being stuck there for months waiting for decisions, years maybe. It's hardly surprising some are just dropping off the radar.
John Oxley, very good to see you this morning. Thank you very much indeed.
Stay with us, watching and listening to Britain's Newsroom, because coming up, we're going to be talking about Ofsted. Its chief inspector has vowed to change the system after that report into the death of Ruth Perry, who took her own life. It showed an almost complete absence, says the report, of Ofsted training when a school leader shows signs of distress during an inspection. This is Britain's Newsroom on GB News.
Wake up to the headlines with Headliners every morning at 5 a.m. We treat you to the day's biggest stories before anyone else, 7 days a week. You can catch up on everything you need to know before you've even had your kippers. Headliners every morning at 5 a.m, only on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
I'm Andrew Doyle. Join me at 7 o'clock every Sunday night for Free Speech Nation, the show where I tackle the week's biggest stories in politics and current affairs with the help of my two comedian panellists and a variety of special guests.
Free Speech Nation, Sunday nights from 7 on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Big news, big debates, big opinion. Patrick Christie's Tonight is the week's biggest show. Every weekday, 9 to 11 p.m, we've got the inside track on the day's top stories. There'll be sharp takes you won't get anywhere else. We will set the news agenda, not just follow it, and I want to bring you along for the ride. Whatever it is, we'll have our finger on the pulse. It's news, but it's this close to entertainment. Patrick Christie's Tonight, 9 to 11 p.m, only on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Now then, Lee Anderson here. Join me on GB News on my show, The Real World, every Friday at 7 p.m.
I'm not eating bloody cat. Are you
delicious?
mental?
Open your mouth. OK, here comes a train. Reminds me of the scene in Singing in the Rain.
Adam, is that a good one?
Whoa! Join me at 7 on GB News, Britain's news channel.
When the news happens, it happens here.
And really important breaking news.
Breaking news this morning.
On TV, radio and online, the news starts here on Britain's Newsroom.
All the biggest stories and the answers that you need from across the UK and beyond.
Join Britain's Newsroom from 9:30 on GB News.
The People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Have a great Saturday night with me, Leo Curse, on the Saturday Night Showdown. It's a crazy world out there, so come and make fun of it with me, my panel of comedians, and a couple of people who actually know what they're talking about. The Saturday Night Showdown is your front row ticket to the clown show every Saturday. Only on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Good afternoon, Britain.
Good afternoon, Britain. Join us, Tom and Emily,
To find out what's happening in the heart of Westminster.
and why it matters to you.
Weekdays from midday, we bring you the most compelling stories from across the United Kingdom.
And from your doorstep to our inbox.
That's right, we want to hear from you.
GB News,
Britain's news channel.
GB News, unlike other broadcasters, isn't obsessed with the London-Westminster bubble. We think there's a nation beyond the M25, and that's why we talk about the issues that matter across the land. Join me on State of the Nation, 8 to 9 o'clock, Monday to Thursday, on GB News. Daisy's listening, and you should too.
Every Sunday from 11, join Michael Portillo.
There will be topical discussion, looking at the week before and the week to come. So kick back and relax at 11 a.m. on Sundays on GB News with me, Michael Portillo. GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
When the news happens, it happens here.
And really important breaking news.
Breaking news this morning.
On TV, radio and online, the news starts here on Britain's Newsroom.
All the biggest stories and the answers that you need from across the UK and beyond.
Join Britain's Newsroom from 9:30 on GB News.
The People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Good morning, you're watching Britain's Newsroom. The time is 10:25 and you're with Pip Thompson and me, Ellie Costello.
Ofsted's chief inspector has vowed to make changes to the system in the wake of the tragic death of head teacher Ruth Perry.
Well, joining us now is our reporter, Ray Addison. Good to see you this morning, Ray. So describe for us, if you will, the changes that the Ofsted chief inspector is vowing to make to the system.
Well, people here telling me that they very much welcome the changes that are being introduced and saying that they hope it will stop what they describe as a culture of fear over these school inspections. The first thing that was announced, the major announcement, is that there will be now an independent inquiry into how Ofsted has responded to the coroner's report. Now, of course, there's also a number of other changes as well. Apologies for the bandsaw that's just started behind me. A number of other changes include one key element being that headmasters, headmistresses will be able to stop inspections, pause inspections if they have concerns over the mental health of their staff. Inspectors have also been given mental health awareness training to be able to identify signs of distress in teachers whilst they're carrying out those inspections. There's also going to be an expert panel being put together, a well-being panel, if you will, to be able to talk directly with head teachers and see how they're responding and reacting to those inspections. Something called the Big Listen is being introduced as well. That's going to be involving parents alongside other stakeholders, as they say, and they're going to be having a conversation about all of these things that are being introduced, and they'll have their chance to say whether they believe that more needs to be done. Now, of course, Ofsted's plans have been welcomed by Mrs. Perry's family. Her sister, Professor Julia Waters, said that the changes were encouraging, but the culture of school inspections still needs a radical overhaul. Unions have also weighed in. The Association of School and College Leaders said that these actions by Ofsted are positive, they're in the right direction, but they do not address all of the problems. And of course, parents here saying that many of whom have sent their own children to this school over the years, saying that a lot of these new ideas do sound very, very encouraging, but they have come obviously too late.
The thing I just want to look at with you as well is this use of a single word to describe a school, to critique a school, because in Ruth Perry's case, Caversham Primary was downgraded from the highest level, outstanding, to the lowest, that was inadequate. And I know that's something that Ruth's sister, she has a real problem with, doesn't she? Because she says it's just simply too simplistic.
Yes, I believe there was. I mean, the school was rated very highly in all categories apart from leadership, I understand, and the particular concern there was in relation to the process of safeguarding. And I think there are serious concerns among head teachers across England that these single-use terms can be very misleading. They can give the wrong impression to local communities and can have a very detrimental impact upon the school. And I'm sure that is something that the big listen panel of parents and other stakeholders will be wanting to weigh in on, and hopefully we will see some announcements of changes potentially towards those terms.
Ray Addison, thanks very much.
Well, joining us now is maths teacher and author Bobby Seagull. Good to see you this morning, Bobby. I hope you were listening across Ray Addison's report just then, but he was describing the changes to the system that have been mentioned by the Ofsted Chief Inspector, including the right for head teachers to pause inspections if they feel like it's in detriment to any of their staff's mental health. And there's also going to be mental health awareness training for Ofsted inspectors. What do you make of those changes?
Yeah, so good morning, Ellie and Pip. And obviously, firstly, again, it's a really tragic and shocking death of Ruth Perry, a dedicated head teacher. Again, condolences to her and her family and her school community. But in terms of Ofsted's new report, I guess, based on the coroner's findings, I think it is welcome. With the new head of Ofsted, Sir Martin Oliver, you get a sense that he is trying to change things, trying to be committed towards reform. And mental health is something that's really important. And, 10, 15 years ago, when I joined teaching 10 years ago, it wasn't really a concern. Whereas now, as a society, we have moved forward. So if head teachers feel as there's immense pressure being put on their staff, it is a welcome measure that Ofsted can temporarily pause the proceedings. But again, it is a tough thing because Ofsted, they're ultimately there for the community and for children and parents so they can make the best assessment whether this school is right for their child. But that's obviously in tension against school teachers trying to deliver this curriculum. And you want something that's fair to both the communities, but also the teachers as well.
What do you think of the suggestion that there are some schools, this has been reported today, where the behaviour of pupils was so bad that there were no-go areas and teachers had to lock themselves in for their own safety? Is that anything that you've heard about in your experience? Or, yeah, what can you tell us about that? Does it happen?
Well, fortunately, in my experience, I've been okay in the schools I've been teaching for a decade. But what I will say is this is true. There are cases of my friends who are teachers who've had real difficulty with behaviour issues. And I think this is one thing where schools are a reflection of society. Our societies, homes, broken homes, children coming from these into school environment. If they don't respect their family, home, parental environment, why are they going to respect someone externally in a teacher? And again, if we're trying to think about, recently I talked about education being the silver bullet to solving many of our country's woes. If that really is the case, then our schooling system has to be really solid. And if we've got places where teachers are afraid for their own well-being, then that recruitment and retention crisis that we're always hearing about, secondary schools, primary schools failing to fill up their teachers in terms of staffing, then stories of these are just going to perpetuate that and make it more difficult for people to join the teaching profession.
Very challenging indeed. Bobby Seagull, very good to speak to you this morning. Thank you very much. Thank you. And as Bobby was saying there, heartbreaking news about Ruth Perry, who died last January. If you have been affected by the content of that story and what happened to Ruth Perry, do speak to someone you can trust, or you can call the Samaritans at any time for free. The number is 116 123 and it's on your screens for you now.
Let's bring you bang up to date with all the latest news headlines. We have got plenty more to come, so do stay with us. But now, here's a roundup with Sam Francis.
Pip, thank you very much and good morning from the GB Newsroom. The headlines are just after 10:30. Well, our top story today, more than 3,000 jobs are at risk, with steel giant Tata expected to press ahead with its plans to close furnaces in South Wales. The job losses are understood to be UK-wide, but most will be from the Port Talbot site. It's considered to be the country's single biggest emitter of carbon dioxide. The cuts come as the company moves to a greener way of working. Unions are holding talks with executives to try to save jobs. Meanwhile, the Home Office has admitted more than 6,000 asylum seekers are missing in the UK. It comes as members of the House of Lords outline plans that could stall Rishi Sunak's flagship Rwanda policy. The group of peers, led by a former Labour Attorney General, wants to delay the treaty until the government can show that Rwanda is safe for asylum seekers. New Ofsted guidance will allow school visits in England to be paused if staff show signs of distress. The announcement comes after a coroner called for change following the death of head teacher Ruth Perry. She took her own life in January last year after Caversham Primary School was downgraded from outstanding to inadequate. And a senior NATO official has warned there could be an all-out war with Russia within the next 20 years. Dutch naval officer Admiral Rob Bauer says that although the military alliance is preparing for a conflict, civilians must also be ready. It comes after Defence Secretary Grant Shapps said the threat could be sooner and more wide-reaching, involving Russia and China, Iran and North Korea. And you can get more on all of those stories by visiting our website, gbnews.com.
For stunning gold and silver coins you'll always value, Rosland Gold proudly sponsors the GB News Financial Report.
And here's a first look at the markets this morning. The pound will buy you $1.2684 and €1.1654. The price of gold is £1,601.58 per ounce, and the FTSE 100 is currently at 7,496 points.
Rosland Gold proudly sponsors the GB News Financial Report.
Still to come, after a top NATO military official has warned that civilians must prepare for all-out war with Russia in the next 20 years, is it time the UK reintroduced national service? And if so, who should be eligible? We want your thoughts. GBviews at gbnews.com. This is Britain's Newsroom on GB News.
Your weekend starts here with Friday Night Live with me, Mark Dolan, 8 till 9 on GB News. Big stories, big guests and big laughs as we get you ready for a cracking weekend. That's Friday Night Live with Mark Dolan, Fridays 8 till 9 on GB News. Bring your own drinks, the admission's free.
In the GB Newsroom, we bring you the news as it happens. With our team of dedicated journalists across the UK, we're ready to give you accurate reporting every day. When the news breaks, we'll be there with bulletins on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Big news, big debates, big opinion. Patrick Christie's Tonight is the week's biggest show. Every weekday, 9 to 11 p.m, we've got the inside track on the day's top stories. There'll be sharp takes you won't get anywhere else. We will set the news agenda, not just follow it, and I want to bring you along for the ride. Whatever it is, we'll have our finger on the pulse. It's news, but it's this close to entertainment. Patrick Christie's Tonight, 9 to 11 p.m, only on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Join us every night on GB News at 11 p.m. for Headliners, which is 3 top comedians going through the next day's news stories, which is exactly what you need, because when the establishment has gone crazy, you need some craziness to make sense of it.
Headliners. You don't have to bother reading the newspaper. We've got it covered for you. Every night at 11 p.m. and repeated every morning at 5 a.m. We won't send you to sleep like some of the other paper review shows out there.
So join us 11 p.m. every night on GB News,
the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
I'm Michelle Dewberry, and I'm not here to tell you what to think. I'd much rather hear what you have to say. So, send in your opinions to gbviews at gbnews.com. Keep them clean, and you never know, I might read them out. With my panel here on Jubes & Co, we debate, we get stuck into the issues of the day on a show where all views are welcome, especially yours. GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Tired of the usual focus-tested, pre-prepared Westminster runaround? Well, so am I.
So you want higher taxes?
Is your department to blame for this? Are you rethinking this policy? Every Sunday at 9:30, I'll be sitting down with those in power to get the truth about the issues affecting you.
Let's be honest, we've known about the cost pressures of this project for years, not months.
That's the Camilla Tominey Show, a politics show with personality. On GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
I think the most exciting bit for me is talking to people.
People who I think are ignored often by the major news channels. We're going to give news they want to hear. There's a voice there that needs to be heard. I think there's a chance here for a diversity of opinion to be expressed, which you don't find elsewhere. It's really exciting.
We don't hold back. We're free to say how decisions that are taken here
affect us all around the country. Only on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Good afternoon, Britain.
Good afternoon, Britain. Join us, Tom and Emily,
To find out what's happening in the heart of Westminster.
and why it matters to you.
Weekdays from midday, we bring you the most compelling stories from across the United Kingdom.
And from your doorstep to our inbox.
That's right, we want to hear from you.
GB News,
Britain's news channel.
Good morning, it's 10:39. You're with Britain's Newsroom on GB News with Pip Thompson and me, Ellie Costello.
And we are joined also by political commentators Matthew Stadlen, good morning, and Emma Webb, good morning to you. And let's discuss, first of all, this warning from a NATO boss that civilians must prepare for war with Russia in the next couple of decades. Matthew, what do you make of this?
Well, he's not mincing his words, is he? We know that Putin is a massive threat, and when they invaded Ukraine for the second time, because don't forget they invaded for the first time in 2014 and were allowed to get away with it, I mean, we were all quite concerned that there might be some sort of nuclear conflict, whether he might use a strategic nuclear missile locally in Ukraine, or whether things could spiral out of control. So this article will do nothing to sort of quell those fears, and actually I think it's going to make some people start to worry again.
Well, you can understand that, can't you? People would be really quite worried reading these headlines. It comes after Grant Shapps this week describing that we'd be lucky to have 5 years without war with Russia.
I mean, it sends probably the wrong message to Russia as well. The thing that I in this story that I find so naive is David Cameron's comments, the now Foreign Secretary Lord Cameron, saying that Ukraine is the struggle of our generation. Now, in the context of this article, I think that, like I said, I think that's very naive because we have no idea what's to come. And that's the sort of thing that you can only really know with hindsight. And I've been supportive of sending aid and help and military assistance to Ukraine. But we have to think about these things in terms of balance. And what's come out of this story is also that other European countries, ourselves included, have depleted our own weapons supplies because we're sending them to Ukraine. So I think we have to have the foresight and avoid this naivety of thinking that, the struggle between Russia and Ukraine is going to be, as David Cameron said, the struggle of our generation. Hang on one second, whilst ignoring the fact that we are in the midst of a really complicated geopolitical situation. Things could very easily go badly wrong. I'm worried about it, and I'm sure many people are as well.
Matthew?
No, the argument against that is that Russia and Putin, who is a monster, has already planted Russian bombs all over Ukraine on the eastern fringes of Europe. And we saw what happened when we didn't act or deter him in 2014. He was emboldened, and he did it again. And if we simply appease him, and this is what Cameron is talking about, then the worry is he's going to feel further emboldened. Is it wise for David Cameron to sort of invoke the idea of appeasement 1930s style when Chamberlain appeased Hitler? Possibly not, because he's our most senior diplomat. But what he's trying to do, in no uncertain terms, is explain the price of inaction, the price of saying to this authoritarian ruler in Russia who has invaded a democratic state, a sovereign state in the form of Ukraine, this is just not an acceptable thing to be doing, and it's not acceptable to be doing it on our continent.
I don't disagree with you. I've made that point myself many times before. But I think that we also have to consider that we as a country, and other European countries too, do have limited resources. So we need to support Ukraine in fighting against Putin with the intention of shoring up our own geopolitical interests, because this is our support for Ukraine isn't just simply an act of benevolence. This is also in our interests to do this, and in our security interests to do this. But we also have to balance that with other considerations as well that are all, like, we have to remember. What I'm suggesting is that we have to remember the objective here. The objective is our own security. And if that means that we have to reconsider how we balance our limited resources, I think we should be putting a lot more money into our military. I think that that's something that we need to take very seriously. And frankly, we need to wake up to the fact that we have enemies in the world. Power is important in protecting peace. And we have to start taking these things seriously, because I think in many ways we've imagined that we are, as Fukuyama put it, at the end of history following the Cold War. But the reality is that history is ongoing, and we don't know what lies in store for this generation, as this NATO leader has suggested.
Forward a little bit, Matthew. How prepared should we be in the next few years to be mobilised? Should civilians be prepared for conscription?
Well, this is what this NATO leader, I mean, it's not the overall chief, it's not Jens Stoltenberg, but this is what he's suggesting. I mean, whether we're actually going to see that, I highly doubt. There are two things here. One is, how flexible are we in our armed forces? We've seen with the Houthi rebel attacks in the Red Sea that we probably need to have a stronger navy than we already do, because it's very expensive to do what we're doing, and we've got recruitment issues. We have to be able to respond flexibly to those events. So that if the Houthis, for example, decide to upgrade their attacks, then we will be able to deal with it. Will we? I don't know. The other issue is nuclear war. And this is what we're not mincing our words, as we've already said. This is what this story is about. And on the face of it, it seems like a sensationalist headline. But what it reminds us is that we live in a very, very dangerous world. And this is nothing to do with whether we've got enough sailors to man our destroyers. This is way, way up the scale. This is about, is there going to be nuclear conflict? Yes, we've got a deterrent, but all it requires is for Putin to get even madder, and possibly even madder than he already is. And we're in serious danger. We just hope that the checks and balances in Russia are sufficient. But this is a real worry. It's just we can't all live our lives every day worrying about it, or we would go mad.
Yeah, we would, absolutely. Let's move on, shall we, to a story in The Guardian today, Emma. The Home Office to allow EU citizens who miss the residency deadline to stay in the UK.
It's a complicated situation, because on the one hand, I think it's unreasonable for the Home... I mean, it seems unreasonable that the Home Office should be the ones to make that decision. This is the civil service making a decision that I think should be a decision of the government. If somebody has prior to that deadline, they had permanent residency, even though it was very widely publicised that there was this deadline coming up where European citizens who, under the Brexit agreement, have a right to stay in the UK if they'd already been living here, they had to apply for settled status. So it's plausible that there are some people who already had permanent status and had permanent residency cards who maybe didn't think that they needed to apply. But given how widely publicised that was, I don't think at this point, the deadline was in 2021, at this point, it's really reasonable to say, oh, well, you just simply didn't know that you were supposed to apply. So ultimately, I think it seems odd to me that this is a decision that will be taken by the Home Office and not by the government.
Matthew, what do you make of this? Significant U-turn, really.
Well, the Home Office is part of the government, so this decision won't have been made without ministerial approval. Look, of course, I understand that if you have a deadline and it's then ignored, and then you say, well, that's actually OK, we didn't really mean our deadline. As a principle in life and in the functioning of government, it's not a brilliant one. On the other hand, when you then look at the the human misery suffered by people whose businesses have been turned upside down because their bank accounts have been frozen or whatever, because they did miss the deadline, they weren't paying attention, they didn't think it applied to them. I am absolutely on the side of clemency, and I would support this move. The problem is there's a wrinkle here, and that is that campaigners say the Home Office hasn't gone the full hog and it is fudging its language. So look, my message to the Home Office is these people have made huge contributions to this country. Yes, some of them may have missed the deadline and they shouldn't have done, but allow them to stay, because I just think the human cost is too big.
Matthew, just need to pause you for the Prime Minister, because a little earlier Rishi Sunak was speaking to the press about Tata's Port Talbot plant steel furnace closure. This is what he had to say.
It will be a worrying time for everyone affected, and because it's a commercially sensitive matter, people appreciate there's a limit to what I can say. But what I can tell you is we are absolutely committed to steelmaking in the UK, and that's why the government provided £500 million to support Tata. The alternative, by the way, was that the entire plant would be closed and all 8,000 jobs would be lost. But the government worked with the company, provided £500 million. The company is investing more money in order to safeguard thousands of jobs, and that's something that the UK government has done. The Welsh government did not participate in that, and that's because we cared about those jobs and the future of steelmaking in Wales and the UK. But as I said, there's an announcement coming later, and it's important that we wait for that.
OK, the House of Lords apparently set to lay down legislation which will delay the passing of the Rwanda Treaty. What do you think of that? And your own Tory peer, Ruth Davidson, says dogs in the street know that it's never going to happen.
Well, I think it's really important that we stop the boats. It was one of the priorities I set out for the country last year. I'm pleased that our plan is working and that we're making progress. The numbers last year were down by over a third. That hasn't happened before, so that shows that we can make a difference here. But in order to fully solve this problem, we need to have a deterrent so that if people come here illegally, they won't be able to stay and will be removed. That's why the Rwanda scheme is so important, and that's why I'm determined to see it through Parliament, get it up and running as quickly as possible so that we can properly solve this problem, because it's about fairness. It's not fair that people come here illegally, and it also puts pressure on public services and communities. I want to see an end to that. We've got a plan. The plan is working. If we stick with it, we can deliver the change that people want to see. Because ultimately, the alternative is that we go back to square one, because the Labour Party have no plan on this issue at all.
So it's not a waste of time and money.
It's absolutely the right thing to do, and people can have
Rishi
confidence in that because
Sunak
our plan
speaking
is
to the
working.
press a little bit earlier on this morning on the Rwanda roadblock, and of course the news that we're expecting from Port Talbot in the next half an hour or so, expecting 3,000 job losses at the Tata Steel plant there. Matthew and Emma are still with us. Matthew, what did you make of that? So Rishi Sunak saying the government is absolutely committed to British steelmaking, but we are facing potentially 3,000 job losses in the next half an hour or so.
The first thing to say is that this is a horrible, horrible situation for all those people and their families, and the impact of it and the impact on their local communities. It's difficult to know, sitting here, whether it is the right commercial decision, and it's difficult to know whether the environmental reasons cited justify the loss of those jobs. I mean, partly this takes me back to the 1980s and to Thatcher's war on the miners. So I think you might have a lot of Conservative-minded people now worrying about these job losses on the grounds of net zero and so forth, but actually would have supported Thatcher's war on the miners in the 80s.
Well, very interesting you say that, because the local councillor in Port Talbot speaking this morning actually made a similar reference point to that, saying that he thinks that Port Talbot now is going to be like the mining communities of the 1980s. He's described it as decimating communities, and he doesn't think they're ever going to recover from this.
Yeah, and that's a massive worry, and it's not just parts of Wales, it's parts of the north of England, which arguably haven't fully recovered from the sort of sense of community and the vibrancy that they had when there were coal mines operating. So I think, I mean, if you use this sort of a wild analogy and you think of the Iraq War and the way that we failed in the peace after Iraq, when these sorts of decisions are made, you have to have a plan in action. Now, that might not be the responsibility of the particular business, but it is the responsibility of government and local government.
Emma, Prime Minister says absolutely committed to British steelmaking, but those words sound very hollow, and he's never going to understand what those people are going through.
Yeah, I mean, his words sounded quite hollow on Rwanda as well. Hell must be freezing over, because I actually agree with Matthew. I think the consequences of deindustrialisation, like you said, in areas of Wales across the north, that happened in the 1980s, that those communities are still living with the impact of that, the economic impact. Those industries haven't been properly replaced. The sense of community was lost. And what we've learned from that is that if you do lose industry like this in an area, then you need to have something in place. There needs to be some kind of plan for all of, because that is a radically large number of job losses for an area to cope with. And we have all sorts of other issues that we're facing as a country at the moment, including cost of living. You need to have something sustainable in place, and I don't mean sort of give a man a fish, I mean teach a man to fish. You need to have some kind of long-term plan to ensure that those areas aren't just sort of laid waste.
And very briefly, based on what our previous conversation was, when we're talking about all-out war with Russia, is it the time to leave us exposed in terms of not being self-sufficient in
Couldn't agree more. You actually read my mind, Ellie, because this is really important, actually, that this NATO spokesman also made this point, which is that, you know, we don't have the industrial capacity in Western countries in order to support a war effort. And so we shouldn't be deindustrialising, I think.
OK, thank you very much, Emma and Matthew. Stay with us. Christopher hopes heated showdown with Reform UK's Richard Tice as he takes the leader to task on immigration. You don't want to miss it.
A brighter outlook with Box Solar, sponsors of weather on GB News.
Morning, Alex Berkill here again with your latest GB News weather forecast. Watch out for some icy patches and freezing fog in places this morning. Otherwise, it is going to be a mostly sunny day for many of us, but across parts of Scotland in particular, here we are likely to see some further outbreaks of rain, sleet and some significant snow too could cause some problems, especially on the roads. Elsewhere, and like I said, lots of fine sunny weather around and mostly light winds, but it is still going to feel quite chilly. Temperatures may be up a degree or so compared to late, but still a little bit on the low side, even for the time of year, and feeling even colder in the north, where we have that wintry weather and some strong winds. Through this evening and overnight, staying dry with largely clear skies across southeastern parts. As a result, we are likely to see a touch of frost here. Further north and west, though, turning increasingly cloudy. The winds will strengthen, and we are going to see some rain, perhaps even some hill snow pushing in as we go through the early hours of tomorrow morning. And all that unsettled weather will lift our temperatures compared to recent nights. Saturday morning then, a touch of frost in the southeast first thing, staying dry here through much of the day, but increasing amounts of clouds. Elsewhere, a cloudier picture, further outbreaks of rain. Some of these could be heavy at times, particularly over higher ground towards the west, and it is going to be windy too, with the risk of coastal gales. Temperatures higher than they have been recently though. On Sunday, it's looking even milder, likely to get into double figures, but it is going to be wet and very windy, potentially stormy too. Bye-bye.
That warm feeling inside from Boxed Boilers, sponsors of weather on GB News.
Do stay with us. That announcement from Tata Steel's Port Talbot plant is imminent. We will be hearing whether they are going to lay off thousands of employees at the steel plant. People warning that Port Talbot will become a ghost town.
GB News is Britain's news channel, and now you can support it. All you have to do is scan that QR code that's up on your screen right now, or you can go to gbnews.com/support and become a GB News member. You'll have fantastic benefits. We're also going to organise special events where you as GB News members can meet the presenters, the on-screen faces. Scan the QR code or go to gbnews.com/support. Thank you so much.
Big news, big debates, big opinion. Patrick Christie's Tonight is the week's biggest show. Every weekday, 9 to 11 p.m, we've got the inside track on the day's top stories. There'll be sharp takes you won't get anywhere else. We will set the news agenda, not just follow it, and I want to bring you along for the ride. Whatever it is, we'll have our finger on the pulse. It's news, but it's this close to entertainment. Patrick Christie's Tonight, 9 to 11 p.m, only on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Now then, Lee Anderson here. Join me on GB News on my show, The Real World, every Friday at 7 p.m.
I'm not eating bloody cat. Are you
delicious.
mental?
Open your mouth. OK, here comes a train.
Reminds me of the scene in Singing in the Rain.
Adam, is that a good one?
Whoa! Join me at 7 on GB News, Britain's news channel.
I'm Andrew Doyle. Join me at 7 o'clock every Sunday night for Free Speech Nation, the show where I tackle the week's biggest stories in politics and current affairs with the help of my 2 comedian panellists and a variety of special guests.
Free Speech Nation, Sunday nights from 7 on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
When the news happens, it happens here.
And really important breaking news.
Breaking news this morning.
On TV, radio and online, the news starts here on Britain's Newsroom.
All the biggest stories and the answers that you need from across the UK and beyond.
Join Britain's Newsroom from 9:30 on GB News.
The People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Wake up to the headlines with Headliners every morning at 5 a.m. We treat you to the day's biggest stories before anyone else, 7 days a week. You can catch up on everything you need to know before you've even had your kippers. Headliners every morning at 5 a.m, only on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Every Sunday from 11, join Michael Portillo.
There will be topical discussion, looking at the week before and the week to come. So kick back and relax at 11 a.m. on Sundays on GB News with me, Michael Portillo. GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
I'm Michelle Dewberry, and I'm not here to tell you what to think. I'd much rather hear what you have to say. So send in your opinions to gbviews@gbnews.com. Keep them clean, and you never know, I might read them out. With my panel here on Jubes & Co, we debate, we get stuck into the issues of the day on a show where all views are welcome, especially yours. GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Have a great Saturday night with me, Leo Curse, on the Saturday Night Showdown. It's a crazy world out there, so come and make fun of it with me, my panel of comedians, and a couple of people who actually know what they're talking about. This Saturday Night Showdown is your front row ticket to the clown show every Saturday, only on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Good morning, it's 11 a.m. on Friday, the 19th of January. This is Britain's Newsroom on GB News with Pip Thompson and me, Ellie Costello.
Tata Steel job cuts. Around 3,000 jobs are at risk as the steel giant pushes ahead with plans to close furnaces in South Wales. Is this the cost of going green? An announcement is imminent. Our business and economics editor Liam Halligan has the latest.
Bright skies down here in South Wales, but a grim atmosphere among the Port Talbot community. Britain's biggest steel plant, industrial heritage at stake, 3,000 jobs at risk.
Another Rwanda roadblock. The House of Lords threatens to stop Rishi Sunak's flagship Rwanda policy as the Home Office admits more than 6,000 asylum seekers are missing in the UK.
A call to arms. A top NATO chief issues a stark warning that civilians should prepare themselves for an all-out war with Russia over the next 2 decades. Would you sign up to serve your country?
Capital fare freeze. Travel fares in London have been frozen for a year, with London Mayor Sadiq Khan saying he wasn't prepared to stand by while passengers pay more for public transport.
So lots to be talking about this morning, to be debating. Do let us know what you think. We do love to read your views. GB News, or even GBviews at gbnews.com. Let's get your latest headlines with Sam Francis now.
Pip and Ellie, thank you very much, and good morning from the GB Newsroom. Our top story at 11. More than 3,000 jobs are at risk, with steel giant Tata expected to press ahead with their plans to close furnaces in South Wales. The job losses are understood to be UK-wide, but most will be from the Port Talbot site. It's considered to be the country's single biggest emitter of carbon dioxide, and the cuts come as the company moves to a greener way of working. Unions are holding talks with executives to try to save jobs. Prime Minister Rishi Sunak says the government is absolutely committed to British steelmaking.
The government provided £500 million to support Tata. The alternative, by the way, was that the entire plant would be closed and all 8,000 jobs would be lost. But the government worked with the company, provided £500 million. The company is investing more money in order to safeguard thousands of jobs. And that's something that the UK government has done. The Welsh government did not participate in that. And that's because we cared about those jobs and the future of steelmaking in Wales and the UK. But as I said, there's an announcement coming later, and it's important that we wait for that.
Well, in some breaking news just coming to us here in the newsroom, police are trying to trace a mother after a newborn baby was found in a shopping bag in East London. The child was wrapped in a towel and was discovered by a dog walker in Newham. Is now being cared for in hospital. The little girl was uninjured and is safe and well. Police say they're now extremely concerned for the welfare of the baby's mother and they're appealing for help to find her. Elsewhere, the Home Office has admitted more than 6,000 asylum seekers are missing across the UK. It comes as members of the House of Lords outline their plans that could stall Rishi Sunak's flagship Rwanda policy. The group of peers, led by a former Labour Attorney General, wants to delay the treaty until the government can show that Rwanda is safe for asylum seekers. New Ofsted guidance will allow school visits in England to be paused if staff show any signs of distress. The announcement comes after a coroner called for a change following the death of head teacher Ruth Perry. She took her own life in January last year after Caversham Primary School was downgraded from outstanding to inadequate. The coroner said there was an almost complete absence of training for inspectors to look out for signs of distress in school leaders. A senior NATO official has warned there could be an all-out war with Russia within the next 20 years. Dutch naval officer Admiral Rob Bauer says that although the military alliance is preparing for a conflict, civilians must also be ready. It comes after Defence Secretary Grant Shapps said the threat could be sooner and more wide-reaching, involving Russia and China, Iran and North Korea. Defence editor at the Evening Standard, Robert Fox, told GB News earlier there's a real risk of the conflict spreading.
Grant Shapps said he thought we were lucky if we've got 5 years. And this is certainly what the Baltic countries, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, are warning us, because they say after Ukraine, where Russia is on a roll again, it's going to be us and we're all going to be involved.
1/3 of adults here in the UK will run out of money by the end of this month. That's according to new data. Finance firm Karma says the high costs of Christmas are to blame for the sting in January budgets, as many people wait longer to get paid and cope with expensive winter energy bills. The credit company also found that more than half of people strapped for cash will have spent their entire month's income by the 20th of January. To help balance budgets, figures suggest more than a quarter of people plan to avoid socialising, while almost half of us will hold off from purchasing any new tech or gadgets. And a weather warning has been issued with Storm Isha set to hit the UK this weekend. It's only the second time in a storm season that a storm has been named with the letter I. Forecasters say wind gusts of up to 80 miles an hour are expected, and power cuts and damage to buildings are also possible. The warnings come into effect from Sunday evening until Monday morning. That's the latest from the GB Newsroom. For more, we're on TV, on digital radio and, of course, on your smart speaker too. Now, though, more from Ellie and Pip.
Thanks, Sam. You're watching Britain's Newsroom, and thank you so much for your company this morning. Loads of you getting in touch, of course, on that Tata Steel announcement, which we are expecting imminently, potentially 3,000 jobs to go there. Bernard says, is it possible for us to start making our steel? That way we don't have to depend on any other country.
Right.
Yeah, carry on.
No, I was going to say that Graham's got in touch. Good morning. You say you think steel should remain privatised. We're already losing foreign investment and cannot afford to lose any more.
And Ursula says, it's worrying that green issues seem to be eclipsing out central industries. At this rate, we might as well be heading towards deindustrialising the UK.
Well, let's talk to our economics editor, Liam Halligan, who is in Port Talbot for us this morning. Liam, that announcement from Tata is expected within the next half hour. I know Stephen Kinnock was saying earlier he thought there was time for everything to be pulled back from the brink. What's your analysis?
I think there's been a lot of discussion between government, Tata and trade unions over months and even years, and it's all coming to a head, Pip. I do fear that there will be thousands of job losses announced imminently, as you say, not just here at Port Talbot, Britain's biggest steelworks, but also elsewhere in the country, possibly Corby, Hartlepool, Wolverhampton, Shotton and elsewhere. The atmosphere is incredibly grim. Don't be confused by the wonderful sunshine and the beautiful South Wales hills and scenery that surrounds me. I can see, you see behind me, the 2 blast furnaces, only 2 of 4 blast furnaces still in the UK, 2 in Scunthorpe owned by Tata, 2 here in Port Talbot, our biggest steelworks owned by Tata. The issue is that blast furnace behind me, they make so-called virgin steel, steel from iron ore. You need coking coal for that process. Coking coal emits lots of carbon. Tata say that they're going to use instead so-called arc furnaces. They can only rely on scrap steel, recycled steel, so we lose our strategic ability to make steel from scratch. We become increasingly reliant on imported steel, and of course importing steel from elsewhere, that means we import the carbon that's embodied in that steel, plus the diesel to ship the steel and move it, and all the carbon emissions that involves. The trade unions have been making that point very, very coherently for months and even years, in my view, and yet it hasn't swung the argument within government or within Tata. Tata, the Indian conglomerate, say they're spending £2.5 billion converting these blast furnaces to arc furnaces, saving 1,000 or so of the 4,000 jobs that are here. The alternative, as Prime Minister Rishi Sunak has been stressing, is to close down steel making here altogether, despite it being one of the pioneering steel plants of the world. Tata say with those arc furnaces they can keep steel making going here in South Wales, but the workforce here, and I've heard it a lot this morning, Pip, and there's going to be a lot more to come, the workforce are saying, why is this being done to us? Don't those people up there in London, in the metropolitan circles, they want to stress their green credentials, but this is our lifeblood, this is our livelihood, and what's the point in closing down these blast furnaces when you've got China building coal-fired power stations by the dozen as we speak?
And people, I'm sure, would also be saying, I mean, you look at the headlines today, Liam, NATO warning of war with Russia in the next 20 years. I mean, you would think that would leave the UK very exposed, being the only G20 country that cannot now make steel from its raw materials if this and Scunthorpe blast furnaces are to be shut, as we're expecting them to be. Surely self-sufficiency in our industries is more important now than ever.
I think what this story embodies, Ellie, I think you're completely right. What this story embodies is a clash of cultures, almost a clash of civilizations and a clash of worldviews. Why is that? Because you have coming down from parts of the Conservative Party, certainly from big parts of the Labour Party and from much of our media class, you have this view that we must, come what may, lower our carbon emissions. Even though the UK, crikey, not so long ago, 40% of our electricity was from coal-fired power stations. That's now 2%. We've lowered our carbon emissions proportionately, very, very decisively compared to many, many other Western countries. So you've got this worldview that we need to lower our carbon emissions. On the other hand, you've got a view here from the South Wales valleys and across a lot of what we call the Red Wall, not just here in South Wales, the Midlands, the north of England, parts of Scotland, even parts of the West Country, where there is industry and manufacturing and people rely on that for their lives and livelihoods. They can't fathom why it is that steel plants like this are moving away from blast furnaces given that the UK's done so much in their view in terms of lowering carbon emissions, and we account for such a small proportion of carbon emissions around the world. So you've got a real clash of cultures and civilizations here, that you've got that security question that you so rightly posed. As we look around the world and there's more and more geopolitical angst, do we really want to rely on China for steel making, which now dominates world steel making? And then also you have this issue that a lot of people here just feel misunderstood and they feel put upon, and this is being done to them. It'll be very interesting to see what the Labour Party says. Of course, Stephen Kinnock, the son of the former Welsh Labour leader, he is an MP from these parts. He will be stressing the need for government intervention and keeping these blast furnaces going. But a lot of the rest of the Labour Party, certainly those with metropolitan seats in London and elsewhere, won't be saying anything, because they want to be appealing to voters who stress net zero and environmentalism above everything. There are very strong arguments on both sides of this, but the people here in Port Talbot, here in South Wales, they know that their economic life's blood, their very communities, are being threatened here today as we wait in anticipation for what is likely to be bad news, the loss of thousands of jobs here at Britain's biggest steel plant.
OK. Liam Halligan, thanks very much for bringing us that update. We will, of course, return to you when that confirmation or that announcement does come in.
Now, do stay with us. Still to come, we're going to be speaking to our political editor, Christopher Hope, who has sat down with Reform UK's Richard Tice. That's after this short break.
I'm Christopher Hope.
And I'm Gloria Di Piero, bringing you
PMQ's Live here on GB News. Every Wednesday, we'll bring you live coverage of Prime Minister's questions when Rishi Sunak and Sir Keir Starmer go head-to-head in the House of Commons.
We'll be asking our viewers and listeners to submit the questions that they would like to put to the Prime Minister, and we'll put that to our panel of top politicians in our Westminster studio.
That's PMQ's Live here on GB News, Britain's election channel.
In the GB Newsroom, we bring you the news as it happens. With our team of dedicated journalists across the UK, we're ready to give you accurate reporting every day. When the news breaks, we'll be there with bulletins on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Your weekend starts here with Friday Night Live with me, Mark Dolan, 8 till 9 on GB News. Big stories, big guests and big laughs as we get you ready for a cracking weekend. That's Friday Night Live with Mark Dolan. Fridays 8 till 9 on GB News. Bring your own drinks. The admission's free.
Good afternoon, Britain.
Good afternoon, Britain. Join us, Tom and Emily,
To find out what's happening in the heart of Westminster.
and why it matters to you.
Weekdays from midday, we bring you the most compelling stories from across the United Kingdom.
And from your doorstep to our inbox.
That's right, we want to hear from you.
GB News,
Britain's news channel.
Big news, big debates, big opinion. Patrick Christie's Tonight is the week's biggest show. Every weekday, 9 to 11 p.m, we've got the inside track on the day's top stories. There'll be sharp takes you won't get anywhere else. We will set the news agenda, not just follow it, and I want to bring you along for the ride. Whatever it is, we'll have our finger on the pulse. It's news, but it's this close to entertainment. Patrick Christie's Tonight, 9 to 11 p.m, only on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
GB News is Britain's news channel, and now you can support it. All you have to do is scan that QR code that's up on your screen right now, or you can go to gbnews.com/support and become a GB News member. You'll have fantastic benefits. We're also going to organise special events where you as GB News members can meet the presenters, the on-screen faces. Scan the QR code or go to gbnews.com/support. Thank you so much.
Join us every night on GB News at 11 p.m. for Headliners, which is 3 top comedians going through the next day's news stories, which is exactly what you need, because when the establishment has gone crazy, you need some craziness to make sense of it.
Headliners. You don't have to bother reading the newspaper. We've got it covered for you. Every night at 11 p.m. and repeated every morning at 5 a.m. We won't send you to sleep like some of the other paper review shows out there.
So join us 11 p.m. every night on GB News,
the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
I'm Michelle Dewberry, and I'm not here to tell you what to think. I'd much rather hear what you have to say. So send in your opinions to gbviews@gbnews.com. Keep them clean, and you never know, I might read them out. With my panel here on Jubes & Co, we debate, we get stuck into the issues of the day on a show where all views are welcome, especially yours. GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Welcome back. It is exactly 11:17 and 25 seconds. You're with Britain's Newsroom on GB News with Ellie Costello and Pip Thompson.
Now, as the Home Office has admitted, more than 6,000 asylum seekers are missing in the UK, and the House of Lords are threatening to thwart Rishi Sunak's Rwanda policy. Our political correspondent Christopher Hope has sat down with Richard Tice from Reform UK and asked him about his plan to stop the boats. Let's take a listen.
Want one in, one out on net migration. How on earth does that work? You know jolly well you can't be as simple as that in terms of numbers. You can't just say, right, one in, one out. If unless someone leaves, that person can't arrive at Dover.
You absolutely can say our policy on immigration...
It's simplistic nonsense and it won't work.
You've asked me a question, give me the courtesy of answering it. Right, we will freeze non-essential immigration. One in, one out. You can quite absolutely easily do that over an electoral cycle. About on average, 450,000 people leave the country every year. So you can welcome smart immigration of a similar number every year, right, where you've got genuine skill shortages. Let's just remind people, net immigration in the 1980s and 1990s in this country, net was less than 50,000 a year. It's currently running at 750,000 a year. Now, back then, we didn't have huge waiting lists. We were using UK citizens trained up in healthcare and social care to fill our health jobs.
So it's an average over 5 years, is your point?
You do it as an average over 5 years. And here's the point. You've got to be prepared to try new things. That's what we do in the world of business. And here's the thing. I believe that running the country is a bigger version of running a big business.
It never is. It just never
I'm
is.
sorry, I don't accept that. And it really angers me. I'll tell you why. Because we're not growing, Chris. We're running out of money. So something's gone badly wrong. So why don't we try something different?
Stop the boats, big issue this week, illegal migration. What is your plan for illegal migration? How would you stop the boats?
We've got a 6-point plan, but the two key components is we've got to leave the European Convention on Human Rights. I'd like a referendum on that. We'd win it hands down. The country is sick and tired of foreign judges overseas telling us, a sovereign independent nation.
They're judges in a court in Strasbourg, which we sign up to. That doesn't make it a foreign court or a foreign judge.
It is a foreign court because it's not in the United Kingdom. That is literally the definition of foreign, Chris. And they are judges from overseas. That makes them foreign, right? And we're a sovereign independent nation.
Then, pulling out the ECHR?
That's the first point. The second point is you've got to do what you know works. It worked in Australia. We need, in the English Channel, we need to safely pick people up out of the dinghies into our border force cutters. Instead of bringing them to Dover, you take them to Dunkirk and Calais, which we're entitled to do.
You can't do a return agreement with France.
You're asking questions with the completely false premise. Okay. Hear the answer. We're entitled to do that under 2 international legal treaties that I have read. I know exactly the clauses, and no one has disputed it.
Ooh, well, joining us live now from Westminster is our political editor, Christopher Hope. Wow, Chris, that was a feisty 2-minute tease, but we hear there's a full 9-minute version to come. I mean, what does that entail?
But he was knackered after all that.
But he was.
I think we both had our Weetabix that day. Yeah, that was this week. I think, you know, it's a duty on GB News to make sure we hold all leaders of parties who pretend to run the country or want to run the country to account. Now, Reform UK is in the news this week. It went from 8 points to 12 points in a YouGov poll. And in the interview, you'll hear playing out at 1 o'clock in full, Richard Tice says it might go to 13 points. Now, they really are biting at the heels of the Tory party. But I do feel that we haven't, a lot of journalists haven't given enough scrutiny to the policies of this party. And that was the idea of that meeting and that interview there with Richard Tice. Of course, he's a co-presenter of you guys at GB News. He's been on GB News a lot. He has his position there and can sets out his views. But equally, he's a leader of a political party which is running ahead of the Liberal Democrats in the opinion polls, and therefore we have to give them this kind of scrutiny.
And it is right that Reform, they are making a lot of noise, and they could have quite an impact on the general election, could they not, Chris?
Yeah, and that's right. That's totally right, Pippinelli. And what is a worry, I think, for voters, or might be, is that we are facing a kind of 2015 general election. It's the first planned election since that year, and it's worth noting what happened to UKIP. 3.88 million people voted for UKIP. They got just one MP, Douglas Carswell, down in Clacton. Now, the concerns will be for voters that reform is attractive, it's seductive, it offers straightforward policies, one in, one out on immigration, as you heard there. Richard Tice says they can do a returns agreement and take boats back maybe to France, despite the fact the European Union is the negotiating counterparty, not France in that situation. But he thinks he's found legislation, the Safety at Sea Treaty 1974, the UN Convention on the Law at Sea 1982, that will circumvent that. He wants to try new ideas, but the problem is a lot of these new ideas have been looked at, and that's what he's got to convince voters that it's worth taking a risk. The problem is that they may build up literally millions of votes and get 0 MPs, and maybe allow Labour in as a bigger party than it might have been. And that may worry people who vote for reform, because reform is to the right of the Tory party.
OK, Christopher Hope there for us in Westminster. Thank you very much indeed. And you can catch the full 9-minute interview, you won't want to miss it, on Good Afternoon Britain with Tom and Emily this afternoon. We're joined in the studio now by Deputy Editor of Conservative Home, Henry Hill. Good morning. Good morning. What did you think of that interview and Richard Tice's suggestion about this one in, one out policy, which Christopher Hope said, is that not too simplistic?
I mean, I cannot fathom how you would run a one in, one out policy, right? I mean, do you just have a live dashboard that says we've created a space because somebody's left, one person gets to come in, and they waiting somewhere for notification that their space is coming into the country? He said it was averaged out over a 5-year parliament, but no. I think the fundamental problem is, if you want to change immigration in this country and you want to seriously bring down immigration, that means you do have to reckon with how dependent this country has become on immigration for social care, NHS, other services. I think it's a worthwhile mission, but you can't just do it overnight. If you just snapped your fingers overnight and closed the borders, an awful lot of things that currently depend on immigration would fail. We do need to transition them away from that dependence, but we can't do that immediately. He is in the position of every minor party of being able to just say whatever he likes, because he knows that he's never going to have to deliver it.
Well, how much of a threat do you think Reform UK are to the Tories, especially in the next general election? As Christopher Hope was saying, some opinion polls putting them ahead of the Lib Dems.
A lot of Reform's polling tends to be a bit of an artefact. They never really manifest it in any election because they don't have a ground team, they don't have a large membership and so on. So it's often very hard for them to translate that headline figure. I think the big question for Reform is whether or not Farage comes back to lead them personally or to contest a seat, because he has a proven ability to just sort of snap his fingers and conjure parties out of thin air, as he did with the Brexit Party. If that doesn't happen, I think Reform, they will hurt the Tories. In the first past the post, they only need to take a few hundred votes to potentially cost the Tories a seat. But they're in the wrong place politically. You know, a lot of you look at Reform's polling policies, it's kind of sort of Thatcherite economics and then kind of obviously self-serving Lib Dem-style constitutional reform. And that is not where the big gap in British politics is. That is sort of the right on culture, slightly more left on economics.
They'll hurt the Tories, you say, but how much could they actually help Labour?
If there is a close-fought seat between the Tories and Labour and Reform take a few hundred votes or a couple of thousand votes off the Tories, then that could let a Labour MP in. We saw that happen with the Brexit Party in 2019 in seats where they didn't strike a deal with the Conservatives. The Conservatives lost a fair number of seats, I think, by less than the Reform vote. So they could hurt. They're not going to make the difference, but they could hurt.
Got to ask you, whilst we've got you here, Henry, about this latest delay to the Rwanda plan, now in the House of Lords, led by Lord Goldsmith. Could be a significant roadblock, this one. Do you think that we will ever see a plane take off Rwanda?
I suspect we won't see one this side of the election. The House of Lords can actually just kill the bill, because we don't have time to use the Parliament Act because we're so close to the election. So they can put in amendments, and if the House of Commons refuses to accept them, then the bill will fall on what's called double insistence at some time in February or March. And then Rishi Sunak has nothing, which means that he has to negotiate. He either has to negotiate with the Lords for a version of the bill that they will accept, or, if he's thinking politically, he lets them block it, and then he runs in the election on the Lords blocking the bill, and that gives him some cover for not having it.
Henry, we will have to leave it there because we need to go to Liam Halligan, our business and economics editor in Port Talbot. Liam, Tata, they have made the announcement that so many people are dreading.
Indeed, 4,000 people work at the steel plant behind me. Tata have just announced that the plan put forward by trade unions is, quotes, not feasible or affordable. The GMB and community unions, of course, they wanted to keep these blast furnaces open, 2 of just 4 blast furnaces now in the UK, while transitioning to a greener production method. So Tata have literally in the last couple of minutes announced that 2,800 jobs will be lost and 2,500 of those jobs will be cut in the next 18 months. That's despite the British government funding Tata, a massive Indian conglomerate, to the tune of £500 million of taxpayers' money. The GMB union have said these job losses are a crushing blow to Port Talbot and UK manufacturing in general, and many people will agree very strongly with that. I'm afraid there aren't details yet. I'm looking of where else there will be job cuts across the Tata empire here in the UK. There are production facilities at Corby, at Hartlepool, at Wolverhampton, at Shotton and elsewhere, as well as their other flagship steelmaking plant in Scunthorpe. It does now seem, Pip, and I say this with regret as somebody who's covered economics and business and industry and manufacturing in this country for many years, it does now seem that Britain is going to be the only G20 country, the only major advanced economy without the ability to make what we call virgin steel, steel from scratch, from iron ore using coking coal. We're going to instead here in Port Talbot be using what are called arc furnaces, which basically recycle scrap steel, and it's generally of pretty low quality. This is an incredibly sad day for British industry. It's an incredibly sad day for British manufacturing, but it's a particularly sad day for the people of Port Talbot here in South Wales, which for years and years and years was literally the flagship steelmaking plant of the world, a place where many of the modern techniques that are used to make high quality steel were pioneered, not just by the workers behind me, but by their predecessors over 2, 3 and 4 generations. This is a story about a clash of cultures and civilizations, an environmental movement that wants to put environmentalism above all, and ordinary men and women in many parts of the UK that depend on manufacturing processes which that environmental movement feel are now behind the times and indefensible. A very, very difficult situation here in Port Talbot. More news is breaking, and I'll bring you more when I have it.
I mean, absolutely devastating news for 2,800 people who are going to lose their jobs, Liam. But we've also got to think about their families, their businesses, the local economy. This is going to impact so many more people, isn't it, than just the 2,800 jobs that we are describing this morning?
You know, I hear so much, I read so much in my newspapers, and I hear so often on the television and radio about this green jobs revolution. And yeah, there are plenty of green jobs in consulting, and there are plenty of green jobs in the tech sector, and there are plenty of green jobs for, frankly, professional men and women, and they tend to be in city centres. There are green manufacturing jobs too, but they are only very slowly coming on tap. And for many people here in Port Talbot, in Scunthorpe, the other major Tata steelmaking facility where blast furnaces are also going to be closed, it seems, these green jobs are just pie in the sky. They're miles away, they're not for them, they are completely unobtainable, and they currently don't exist. Look, there's a major debate going on in Britain, across the Western world, and indeed across the entire world, about becoming less dependent on hydrocarbons, on oil and gas, becoming less dependent on processes that emit carbon because of the environmental impact. Almost everyone I know wants a cleaner atmosphere, wants to bequeath a cleaner planet for their children and grandchildren. Yet on the other hand, in the here and now, that this rush to net zero by 2050, there are real casualties. There are ordinary people whose lives and livelihoods are not just threatened by this, but are destroyed. People who have lived here in Port Talbot and places similar across the UK, proud communities, they've been manufacturing for generations, and they will feel completely bereft this morning at this news that 2,800 jobs are to go, the vast majority of them here in Port Talbot. This is a very, very sad day for a very, very proud and distinguished part of the United Kingdom.
Liam, thank you very much for bringing us that breaking news that Tata has confirmed plans to cut 2,800 jobs across the UK. Many of those jobs at Port Talbot. And Tata, we understand, is the most economically important private sector company in Wales. So that gives you an idea of the impact it's going to have on so many people, so many families, so many businesses.
Well, for more on that and your other headlines, let's go now to Sam.
Pip and Ellie, thank you very much and good morning from the GB Newsroom. The headlines just after 11:30. Well, as we've been hearing, that breaking news that Tata Steel has confirmed up to 2,800 jobs will be affected as it plans to close blast furnaces in South Wales. The job losses are understood to be UK-wide, but most of them will be from the Port Talbot site. It's considered to be the country's single biggest emitter of carbon dioxide, and the cuts come as the company moves to a greener way of working. We understand the steelmaker plans to close its 2 blast furnaces in the UK by the end of this year. The Home Office has admitted more than 6,000 asylum seekers are missing in the UK. It comes as members of the House of Lords outline plans that could stall Rishi Sunak's flagship Rwanda policy. The group of peers, led by a former Labour Attorney General, wants to delay the treaty until the government can show that Rwanda is safe for asylum seekers. New Ofsted guidance will allow school visits in England to be paused if staff show signs of distress. The announcement comes after a coroner called for change following the death of head teacher Ruth Perry. She took her own life in January last year after Caversham Primary School was downgraded from outstanding to inadequate. And a new weather warning has been issued with Storm Isha set to hit the UK this weekend. Forecasters say gusts of up to 80 miles an hour are expected and power cuts and damage to buildings are also possible. The warnings come into effect on Sunday evening. And as ever, you can get more on all of those stories by visiting our website, gbnews.com.
For exclusive, limited edition and rare gold coins that are always newsworthy, Rosalind Gold proudly sponsors the GB News Financial Report.
And here's another look at today's markets. The pound will buy you $1.2679 and €1.1654. The price of gold is £1,601.80 per ounce, and the FTSE 100 is currently at 7,487 points.
Rosalind Gold proudly sponsors the GB News Financial Report.
Thanks, Sam. Do stay with us. More to come on that breaking news from Tata, who's confirmed plans to cut 2,800 jobs across the UK, but mainly based in Port Talbot in South Wales. We'll have more reaction, more analysis after this short break.
Wake up to the headlines with Headliners every morning at 5 a.m. We treat you to the day's biggest stories before anyone else, 7 days a week. You can catch up on everything you need to know before you've even had your kippers. Headliners every morning at 5 a.m, only on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
I'm Andrew Doyle. Join me at 7 o'clock every Sunday night for Free Speech Nation, the show where I tackle the week's biggest stories in politics and current affairs with the help of my 2 comedian panellists and a variety of special guests.
Free Speech Nation, Sunday nights from 7 on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Big news, big debates, big opinion. Patrick Christie's Tonight is the week's biggest show. Every weekday, 9 to 11 p.m, we've got the inside track on the day's top stories. There'll be sharp takes you won't get anywhere else. We will set the news agenda, not just follow it, and I want to bring you along for the ride. Whatever it is, we'll have our finger on the pulse. It's news, but it's this close to entertainment. Patrick Christie's Tonight, 9 to 11 p.m, only on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Now then, Lee Anderson here. Join me on GB News on my show, The Real World, every Friday at 7 p.m.
I'm
not eating bloody cat. Are you
Delicious.
mental?
Open your mouth. OK, here comes a train.
Reminds me of the scene in Singing in the Rain.
Adam, is that a good one?
Whoa! Join me at 7 on GB News, Britain's news channel.
When the news happens, it happens here.
And really important breaking news.
Breaking news this morning.
On TV, radio and online, the news starts here on Britain's Newsroom.
All the biggest stories and the answers that you need from across the UK and beyond.
Join Britain's Newsroom from 9:30 on GB News.
The People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Have a great Saturday night with me, Leo Curse, on this Saturday Night Showdown. It's a crazy world out there, so come and make fun of it with me, my panel of comedians, and a couple of people who actually know what they're talking about. This Saturday Night Showdown is your front row ticket to the clown show every Saturday, only on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Good afternoon, Britain.
Good afternoon, Britain. Join us, Tom and Emily,
To find out what's happening in the heart of Westminster.
and why it matters to you.
Weekdays from midday, we bring you the most compelling stories from across the United Kingdom.
And from your doorstep to our inbox.
That's right, we want to hear from you.
GB News,
Britain's news channel.
GB News, unlike other broadcasters, isn't obsessed with the London-Westminster bubble. We think there's a nation beyond the M25, and that's why we talk about the issues that matter across the land. Join me on State of the Nation, 8 to 9 o'clock, Monday to Thursday, on GB News. Daisy's listening, and you should too.
Every Sunday from 11. Join Michael Portillo.
There will be topical discussion, looking at the week before and the week to come. So kick back and relax at 11 a.m. on Sundays on GB News with me, Michael Portillo. GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
When the news happens, it happens here.
And really important breaking news.
Breaking news this morning.
On TV, radio and online, the news starts here on Britain's Newsroom.
All the biggest stories and the answers that you need from across the UK and beyond.
Join Britain's Newsroom from 9:30 on GB News.
The People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Welcome back. You are with Britain's Newsroom on GB News, and it's fast coming up to 22:11. Let's see what you've been saying to us at home. Of course, that breaking news in the last few moments. Tata has announced 3,000 job losses, most of them in Port Talbot, but they are across the UK.
Yeah, loads of you getting in touch on that. Andrew says it's not just the 3,000 jobs that have been lost. All of the jobs that were indirectly affected by the chaos at Tata could also be looked at here. And as Liam Hannigan was just reflecting there, who's our business and economics editor, it is the local economy, the local businesses that will also be impacted by this. It's not just the 2,800 people that we're talking about that have very sadly lost their jobs, or they will be losing them in the next 18 months. It is that local community in Port Talbot.
Yeah, people living there are saying it could become a ghost town. Doug, good morning to you. You say to stop making virgin steel in South Wales would be a huge disadvantage to the UK as we head towards a new phase of North Sea oil production. We will require a lot of steel for this. Well, let's get the thoughts of our contributors this morning, political commentators Matthew Stadlen and Emma Webb. Matthew, first of all, what's your reaction to this news? I mean, Rishi Sunak said this morning we're committed to British steelmaking, and then we've got this announcement this morning.
So Tata says, for its part, and this has been a debate, an argument that's been going on, hasn't it? They say for their part that this sort of helps to maintain Britain's ability to produce its own steel. It also says that it's going to cut 1.5% of the UK's overall emissions, as I understand it. That's their viewpoint. What I would say is, before we go anywhere, these are 2,800 jobs, OK? So that, and how many dependents are there? People relying on those people, bringing money home, putting bread on the table. What will be the knock-on impact on local communities? Because if you haven't got people earning the sort of money these guys were, then that's going to affect food stores, supermarkets, car retailers. I mean, the knock-on effects in a relatively small community are enormous.
The Prime Minister said the alternative was that the entire plant would go and then 8,000 jobs would have gone.
Well, it's just difficult to know, isn't it? Sitting in a studio in London, who's telling the truth on this. That's why it's so helpful to have Liam out there actually trying to gauge reaction on the ground. I mean, this does bring up the spectre of the 1980s, doesn't it, and of Thatcher taking on the coal miners. Be really interesting to see how this plays out electorally, because Labour is committed to net zero, and yet here you have Stephen Kinnock saying that this shouldn't have happened. He says, yeah, we absolutely have to meet our environmental targets effectively, but what matters is how we get there. So the devil is in the detail of this, though.
And do we really want to be in a country, Emma, with everything that's going on, turbulent times that we're in a country that can't make its own steel?
Yeah, I think there's a real risk involved with deindustrialisation, and particularly you see this push for net zero, which obviously has an impact on any industry. And I think that the fear is that we will become dependent on other countries in an increasingly turbulent and unreliable geopolitical situation. I don't think that we should be deindustrialising with net zero in mind. So I would also be interested to see how Labour handle this, because obviously, as Matthew has said, it's a lot of people who are losing their jobs, but Labour are pushing for net zero, which is going to have a huge impact on people's jobs all over the country. So there's a conflict there that at some point they're going to have to deal with.
I mean, many of those workers, I'm sure, this morning, Matthew, will be thinking, why did we have to fall off a cliff edge like this? I mean, I know it's going to take 18 months for all of those jobs to go, but many of them, I'm sure, will be saying, why couldn't we have closed one furnace and spent the next 10 years kind of winding down the operation there? Because as Liam Hannigan was saying earlier, amongst all of this geopolitical angst, do we really want to be relying on China for our steel?
No, I mean, Tata would say that actually the process that they're engaging on is going to convert the existing steelworks to a system that is more environmentally friendly, and they're saying that
needs fewer workers.
Needs fewer workers and therefore is more efficient. I mean, this is not a problem that is only facing these 2,800 people, massive though it is. I mean, and it's not just an environmental question. As we continue to move into a world that will be more and more dominated by AI, there are going to be these sorts of questions coming up again and again and again. We waste so much time, I think, I don't mean us here, but we waste, as a sort of political conversation, so much time talking about Rwanda, which is important, but compared to these sorts of issues is dwarfed in significance.
There is some reaction now coming in. Unite General Secretary Sharon Graham, she's saying that Unite's ready to use everything in its armoury to defend steel workers and our steel industry. Tata's plan to close the blast furnaces is simply industrial vandalism on a grand scale. Some really strong words from her. And a UK government spokesperson has just spoken, saying they're determined to secure a sustainable and competitive future for the UK steel sector, which is why we've committed 500 million of UK government support that will transform the site and protect thousands of jobs at Port Talbot and in the UK supply chain. But the problem is that thousands of people are just feeling like, yeah, the government might have done that, but we've also been chucked under a bus here.
Yeah, and like we were saying earlier, you need to make sure that particularly that local area doesn't become a ghost town, because it's not just those people who are affected. Like you were saying, it's other businesses in that area too. This is a hugely important business in the Welsh economy. So the impact of this will be like a butterfly effect. And, you know, I think, like we were saying, it's the same with Unite. I think that we have to face up to the fact that considerations around net zero do have implications for people's lives. And as you were saying, also in terms of automation and reliance on AI, there's also a security threat involved in that as well, in terms of industrial sabotage.
But I do think an important question here is what are people suggesting is the alternative?
Hydrogen furnace.
Yeah, why has this company not done it? And you know, we live in a sort of very rigorously capitalist society, and the Conservative Party tend to be the champions of that. I'm certainly not a member of the Conservative Party, but what should the state have done here? What should Sunak have done beyond what he claims to have done, which is put £500 million into this whole thing? Should the state take over Tata Steel? Should we not allow foreign businesses, foreign firms to own British interests? These are all perfectly legitimate, interesting questions, but they need to be. We need to face them rather than simply saying that these 2,800 jobs should definitely not have gone.
Well, do stay with us, both of you, because we have just had a statement from the leader of the Welsh Conservatives, Andrew R.T. Davies, who has said this: "Today is an incredibly difficult day for Wales. My thoughts are with those steel workers and subcontractors who will be losing their jobs in the coming months and for their families. The situation must be handled with care by all decision makers involved. I'm confident that the Transition Board will achieve this."
It goes on to say, "I remain unconvinced that a blast furnace could not be kept open during the transition to the arc furnaces that Tata have agreed to, protecting many jobs in the short to medium term. This needs to be explained fully as to why this hasn't been done by the company. Many thousands of jobs have been protected with record investment from the UK Conservative government. The story of Port Talbot Steel is far from over, with its sustainable future secured."
OK, what do you make of that, Emma?
Well, I don't know what the right decision in this circumstance is. Ultimately, it is for the company to decide what's in their interests as a company and for their business. But I do think that all of the questions that have been raised are perfectly legitimate, and it remains to be seen whether or not it is the right decision. But regardless, it still is going to have a huge impact on those people who have lost their jobs and on the local economy. So that is still something, you know, regardless of whether or not it was the right thing to do, that we need to consider. You know, how are you going to how are you going to shore up against the implications of this?
So something I do think is important, and I mean, I could live to 1,000 and not vote for Richard Tice's Reform Party, but I think it is helpful that he is part of a discussion here, because he is putting pressure on the established parties, on the two main parties, on decision makers as they exist at the moment. Now Sunak, probably later this year, Starmer, to say, OK, net zero is all very well. I mean, Tice doesn't agree with net zero, I don't think, but it's how you get there. Labour, as a new government, will be forced to face this question, because, as I say, for different reasons, what we're seeing tragically in Port Talbot, and it is tragic because this is a brutal news story, is going to repeat itself again and again. Fine, let's commit to net zero, but then we have to work very hard to scramble backwards and work out how we're going to do that without an enormous amount of pain, often experienced by those on the lowest incomes.
Yeah, I think, if anything, this just shows, doesn't it, how challenging this is going to be politically across the board. I mean, we had Stephen Kinnock from Labour Party, who are very pro-green, saying that this is not something that he wanted to see. Of course, it has now happened. Then we've got leader of the Welsh Conservatives saying he was unconvinced that it couldn't have been kept open. So it's very, very difficult.
If you want net zero.
We're also getting your views, so thank you very much. Keep them coming in. Mark says, what a ridiculous situation the pending closure of the blast furnaces is. Won't do anything to save the environment, you say, Mark, because we'll have to import the stuff from China.
Peter says, so sad to hear the closure of the steelworks and the devastation that it will cause families and businesses. We can find £2.5 billion for Ukraine, but it seems we can't invest and save a necessary steel-producing company.
And Billy says, coming from South Wales, just down the road from Port Talbot, in one way, it definitely would be a shock for many if the steelworks closed. On the other hand, it could create new opportunities in what could be an attractive area for new businesses with far less pollution. Is that a...
Well, this is... Yeah, it's a very important point to raise, and as we endure these sorts of stories moving forward, I come back to what I'm saying. There has to be a plan. Wherever it is possible, there has to be a plan so that we do not allow communities that are affected by these sorts of decisions simply to disintegrate before our eyes in the ways that we experienced in the 1980s in Wales and elsewhere in the country, particularly in the north. It has to be joined up thinking where the government can get involved to stimulate growth, to stimulate the green economy, if that's what's going to replace this, then that is essential.
Emma, I want to pick up on Peter's point on the email there that we can find £2.5 billion for Ukraine, but we can't invest and save a necessary steel-producing company. I mean, surely we need to be able to find money for both, don't we? In this climate in the world, defence and self-sufficiency.
It goes to the point that I was making earlier, that this is all of these things are a balance. You know, there's no sort of extreme solution to anything. You just throw your money into one particular goal and then everything will be fine. You have to make decisions and toss-ups between different considerations. I think it was also a very important point that somebody made there that, in reaching net zero in this way, all you're doing is outsourcing the production to another country. You're not doing anything overall to improve the situation. Meeting net zero when we are such a small proportion of global polluters isn't really going to make much of a difference. I actually think that this commitment to net zero is extreme, and when we actually have to have whichever government it is face up to the reality of what net zero means, they'll realise that this is not something that you can achieve without deindustrialisation. It's not something that people will want.
And we're being led to believe that steel will continue to be manufactured in this country. That's not going to stop. I mean, whether it's true or not remains to be seen, but Tata says that this is helping to safeguard.
Well, we have what Tata says, because there is a statement, Matthew, which we want to bring you, and it says this plan is intended to reverse more than a decade of losses and transition from the legacy blast furnaces to a more sustainable green steel business.
The transformation would secure most of Tata Steel's UK's existing product capability and maintain the country's self-sufficiency in steelmaking, whilst also reducing Tata Steel's UK's CO2 emissions by 5 million tonnes per year and overall UK country emissions by 1.5%. So, Matthew, back to you. What do you make of that?
That's what I was saying at the out point of our little segment here. The question is whether they're right. And how can we judge that right now? The hope is that they are right, but we can't get away today from the fact that 2,800 human beings have lost their jobs, and that's devastating.
Yeah, it doesn't take away from the very human impact of this all, and that's how the workers will be feeling today, Emma.
Yeah, I mean, like I say, remains to be seen whether or not this is the right decision. I'm not sure what the right decision is for their business, and I'm not against, making companies making decisions independently to do what's best for their company or to make their operations more efficient. But regardless of all of that, there is a human side to this story, and that is that there will be a huge number of people, their families, their local community, who are going to have to deal with the implications of this, and that those implications are also in a broader context of people facing real difficulties and already facing real difficulties in Wales. So I think that the human side of this story is important.
But if the green economy does manage to replace these jobs, and that is the hope, they're not necessarily going to happen in Port Talbot. They're not going to be located necessarily in Port Talbot, which means families having to, mothers, fathers having to commute potentially great distances, maybe families having to uproot and move elsewhere. And that's what can create ghost towns.
Matthew, thank you so much. Thank you, Emma. That is it from us on Britain's Newsroom. Thank you for your company.
Yeah, good afternoon, Britain. It's up next with Tom and Emily.
Bye-bye.
It is indeed. Well, our top story today has got to be the 2,800 job losses at Tata Steel. We're going to be asking, is the push to decarbonisation to blame?
Also, Nicola Sturgeon unveiling something at a COVID inquiry. What is it? Stick around.
A brighter outlook with Box Solar, sponsors of weather on GB News.
Morning, Alex Burkill here again with your latest GB News weather forecast. Watch out for some icy patches and freezing fog in places this morning. Otherwise, it is going to be a mostly sunny day for many of us, but across parts of Scotland in particular, here we are likely to see some further outbreaks of rain, sleet and some significant snow too. Could cause some problems, especially on the roads. Elsewhere, and like I said, lots of fine sunny weather around and mostly light winds, but it is still going to feel quite chilly. Temperatures may be up a degree or so compared to late, but still a little bit on the low side, even for the time of year, and feeling even colder in the north, where we have that wintry weather and some strong winds. Through this evening and overnight, staying dry with largely clear skies across southeastern parts. As a result, we are likely to see a touch of frost here. Further north and west, though, turning increasingly cloudy. The winds will strengthen, and we are going to see some rain, perhaps even some hill snow pushing in as we go through the early hours of tomorrow morning. And all that unsettled weather will lift our temperatures compared to recent nights. Saturday morning then, a touch of frost in the southeast first thing, staying dry here through much of the day, but increasing amounts of clouds. Elsewhere, a cloudier picture, further outbreaks of rain. Some of these could be heavy at times, particularly over higher ground towards the west, and it is going to be windy too, with the risk of coastal gales. Temperatures higher than they have been recently though. On Sunday, it's looking even milder, likely to get into double figures, but it is going to be wet and very windy, potentially stormy too. Bye-bye.
That warm feeling inside from Box.
Your weekend starts here with Friday Night Live with me, Mark Dolan, 8 till 9 on GB News. Big stories, big guests and big laughs as we get you ready for a cracking weekend. That's Friday Night Live with Mark Dolan, Fridays 8 till 9 on GB News. Bring your own drinks, the admission's free.
In the GB Newsroom, we bring you the news as it happens.